The Nile River, the eternal heartbeat of Egypt. For more than 3,000 years, while empires rose and fell, while gods were worshipped and then forgotten, while kings emerged and vanished into the sands of time, there was one thing that never ceased to flow: the Nile. A liquid thread in the middle of the desert, a constant whisper that kept one of the most fascinating civilizations in history alive. If ancient Egypt was a body, then the Nile was its blood, and its unbreakable and generous course set the rhythm for every harvest, every ritual, every gesture of faith and power. To understand Egypt is, above all, to understand the Nile, because without it, there would be no temples, no pyramids, no hieroglyphs patiently carved into stone. There would be silence, drought, oblivion. But the Nile did not allow that. The Nile spoke, and Egypt listened. From the heart of Central Africa, in the region of the Great Lakes, is born this river that seems more like a god than a body of water. It is fed by two sources: the White Nile, slow, deep, patient like a wise old man, and the Blue Nile, impetuous and turbulent, like a young warrior. Both merge in Sudan, and from there begin a journey of more than 6,000 kilometers to the north, defying the arid landscape, crossing mountains and ravines, until breaking through the Egyptian desert with an almost mystical determination. It is, without question, the longest river in the world. But what truly makes it unique is not its length, but what it left in its wake: life, civilization, memory. In the land of Egypt, where rain barely falls and the sun is a severe master, the Nile was the difference between existence and nothingness. Each year, reliably, between the months of July and October, its waters overflowed with a silent force that did not destroy, but transformed. It flooded the fields, depositing on them a layer of dark, fertile, miraculous silt. That black land, the Kemet of the ancient Egyptians, was a gift from the gods. A soil so fertile it allowed for abundant harvests, even in a ruthless geography. This annual cycle was not unpredictable, but as reliable as the sunrise. And from that regularity emerged a culture that learned to read the rhythm of nature as if it were a sacred text. The flood did not only irrigate the land, it marked the calendar, organized the economy, gave meaning to time. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons that revolved around the Nile: Akhet, the inundation; Peret, the growing; and Shemu, the harvest. Each phase brought with it rituals, celebrations, political decisions. The Pharaoh, earthly representative of the gods, was also the guarantor of the balance of that cycle. His legitimacy depended, in part, on the waters arriving with the right strength and measure. Too much flood meant destruction. Too little meant hunger. Such was the close bond between the river and power. Egyptian cities grew along its banks like pearls strung on an ancestral necklace. Thebes, Memphis, Hermopolis, Edfu, all looked to the river with reverence, as one gazes upon the face of an ancient god. The houses, the temples, the palaces, everything was arranged around its course. And in the midst of that landscape of reeds and papyrus boats, of plowed fields and priests dressed in linen, a life was woven that depended entirely on that flow. Nothing was done without the Nile. To navigate it meant to move between worlds, from south to north, dragged by the current, from north to south, propelled by the winds. It was a living highway, a stage for trade, war, and diplomacy. The Egyptians were not naive. They knew their survival hung on a fragile balance. That is why they made the Nile an object of worship. They deified it. They sang to it. They depicted it in human and sacred forms. Hapi, the god of the flood, was one of the most venerated. He was represented with prominent breasts, a symbol of fertility, and with offerings in his hands. Hapi was not just a spirit of the waters. He was the very heart of the country beating every year. In his honor, festivals were held in temples, prayers were offered, floating offerings were cast. The entire people both feared and loved that liquid deity who decided their fate. The priests kept meticulous records of the levels of the Nile. They did so with a tool called a nilometer, a sort of stepped well carved into stone, where one could precisely measure how much the water had risen. Based on that measurement, crucial decisions were made. How much food to store, how many taxes to collect, how many men to mobilize to build canals or raise temples. Because the Nile was not only nature, it was politics, it was economy, it was social engineering. The Egyptians also learned to tame it. They created a system of canals, reservoirs, and dikes to control its flow, to distribute its benefits beyond the simple flood. The hydraulic technology they developed was impressive for their time. It was not just a matter of waiting for the river to do its work, but of collaborating with it, of anticipating its whims. The Nile was an ally, but also a teacher, and Egypt thrived because it learned to listen to it. The relationship with the river was so intimate, so constant, that even spiritual and funerary orientation depended on it. The eastern bank of the Nile, where the sun was born, was the realm of the living. The western bank, where the star died each afternoon, was the domain of the dead. That is why necropolises, funerary temples, the tombs of pharaohs and nobles were always built on the western side. It was sacred geography, a reflection of the cycle of life. The river marked the passage between existence and eternity, between flesh and soul. It is no coincidence that the pyramids, those monuments that defy modern understanding, are arranged facing the Nile, as if waiting for something more than tourists. For centuries, the river was the silent witness of the rise and fall of dynasties, of foreign conquests, of religious revolutions and palace betrayals. But it never stopped flowing. While men poisoned themselves with power and temples crumbled into ruins, the Nile kept advancing, silent and vital, like a destiny that cannot be stopped. Even today, when satellites orbit the planet and modern dams try to discipline it, the Nile remains a force beyond full control. It still pulses at the heart of Egypt. It still carries with it centuries of history, of glory, of secrets hidden in its silt. The modern peoples who live along its banks may no longer pray to Hapi or consult nilometers, but they feel the same reverent respect as the ancients, because the river has not forgotten. The river has seen too much. And although its course may seem identical every year, every drop that flows carries with it fragments of a distant past, echoes of a civilization that knew how to listen to the whispers of the water. And so, as the Nile continues its journey to the Mediterranean, we dive even deeper into the sands of history. Because if the river was the origin, it is now time to explore the first great miracle that rose from its shores: the unification of Egypt, the birth of a kingdom that would shape the course of an entire era. The birth of a kingdom, prehistory and unification. Before Egypt became the empire of pyramids, of gigantic temples and legendary pharaohs, it was a fragmented mosaic of villages, tribes, and clans who lived with their feet on the ground and their eyes fixed on the sky. In those remote times, long before the concept of Egypt as we know it existed, people were already tilling the land, already weaving linen, already burying their dead with amulets and pottery, as if even in the twilight of prehistory, the ancients could sense that something immense was taking shape beneath the sand. On the banks of the Nile, in the millennia before the year 3500 before our era, Neolithic cultures were slowly developing, beginning to move beyond simple subsistence to build the foundations of a unique civilization. These were small yet well-organized communities, capable of domesticating animals, perfecting pottery, constructing adobe homes, and storing grain. They were skilled at adapting to their environment, and that adaptation was the secret to their survival. Archaeological evidence, bone remains, pottery fragments, polished stone tools, speaks of constant evolution, of a humanity learning with each flood season. During this long period, the Nile Valley was not a unified nation, but a constellation of local centers with their own cultures, regional gods, and tribal chiefs who competed for control of the most fertile lands. This stage, known as the pre-dynastic period, is essential to understanding what came later, because it is here that the roots of Egyptian art, religion, writing, and centralized power were born. Everything that defined Egypt for millennia began in that primitive breeding ground, in villages like Nakada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, names that still resonate in the papyri of archaeologists. The rivalry between Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north marks the first great axis of tension in this story. Lower Egypt, with its more humid climate and access to the Mediterranean, had a more developed agricultural life and earlier connections to foreign trade. Meanwhile, Upper Egypt, drier and more rugged, developed a militarized, austere, and deeply religious culture. As centuries passed, these two poles grew in power, in organization, and in ambition. And as always happens when two worlds collide, conflict was inevitable. For generations, the chiefs of Upper Egypt eyed the riches of the north with suspicion. And from the delta, the leaders of Lower Egypt watched warily as their southern neighbors advanced relentlessly. The temples of each region exalted their own gods. In the north, the goddess Wadjet reigned, represented as a cobra, while in the south, Nekhbet the vulture was revered as protector. Two crowns, two very distinct crowns, the white one of Upper Egypt and the red one of Lower Egypt. And in the midst of that duality, an idea began to take shape, an idea that would change the course of history: unification. The figure who leads this process is a legendary king named Narmer, although some know him as Menes. His name appears on the ceremonial Narmer palette, a carved slate object that is not only a jewel of ancient art, but one of the oldest political documents in the world. On this palette, the king is shown crushing his enemies with a mace, wearing the southern crown on one side and the northern crown on the other. It is an image of absolute power, of symbolic and military control. Although some scholars debate whether Narmer was the true unifier or the last in a series of conquerors, the truth is that unification occurred sometime between the year 3100 and 2900 before our era, and with it, Egypt was born as a single nation, with one throne and one god above all others, the Pharaoh. This process was not peaceful. Behind the legend of Narmer are military campaigns, alliances, betrayals, and complex logistical strategies. A new capital was established in Memphis, in an intermediate area between Upper and Lower Egypt, to maintain political balance between the two regions. From there, the pharaoh ruled as a mediator between worlds. But he was not a common king. He was seen as the embodiment of the god Horus, a divine figure on earth, whose duty was not only to maintain political order, but to guarantee Maat, the cosmic balance of the universe. With unification came new symbols. The double crown, known as the Pshent, combined both colors, the white of the south and the red of the north. The lotus flower and the papyrus, representing each region, began to appear together in reliefs and frescoes. The hieroglyphic language became standardized. The gods began to merge into a shared worldview, and the state apparatus began to form with an efficiency that still amazes today. Tribute collection was centralized, collective labor was organized for large-scale projects, and an administrative system was established that allowed the pharaoh to know and control every corner of the kingdom. From that moment on, Egypt was no longer a collection of scattered peoples, but a civilization with a common identity, with a shared memory and a collective ambition. And although the centuries that followed would bring crises, divisions, and profound changes, that initial unification left an indelible mark on how Egyptians understood power, geography, and their place in the world. The birth of the Egyptian kingdom was much more than a military conquest. It was a transformation of collective consciousness. It was the moment when a fragmented farming culture rose toward a vision of unity, of permanence, of eternity. From that point forward, each pharaoh would look back, seeking legitimacy from Narmer, as if his shadow stretched across the millennia. And each generation, in building temples, aligning tombs, recording decrees in stone, would repeat that inaugural gesture, the desire to keep united what was once divided. Thus, the destiny of Egypt was sealed. And now that the kingdom has been born, that the crown shines and the throne has been claimed, the time of great constructions begins, of monumental tombs that reach toward the sky. Because the next chapter leads us straight to the heart of an age-old obsession, the pursuit of eternity carved in stone. The pyramids await us. Pyramids, mountains for eternity. When the first rays of the sun pierce the desert of Giza and strike the limestone of the pyramids, the modern world comes face to face with the immortal ambition of a civilization that refused to die. In the presence of these colossi of sacred geometry, everything else seems insignificant. Neither the tallest skyscrapers nor the monuments of steel and glass of our time manage to awaken the same mixture of awe and reverence. Because the pyramids are not merely tombs or ancient constructions. They are ideas turned to stone. They are the visible manifestation of an obsession that shaped the history of ancient Egypt from its earliest days. To defeat time, to conquer death, to live forever. This dream of eternity began to take shape during the Old Kingdom, a period that lasted from around the year 2690 to 2118 before our era. It was during this time that the pharaohs reached a level of power, wealth, and social control strong enough to undertake projects of unprecedented scale. But beyond politics or economics, there was a much deeper motivation. The unshakable belief that death was not the end, but a transition to another plane of existence. And for the pharaoh to cross that boundary and be reborn among the gods, his body had to be protected, his soul guided, his name preserved. Thus, the pyramids were born. The first step was a conceptual leap. The tomb would no longer be a simple shelter underground. It would become a visible, imposing structure, full of symbolism. The revolution began with Djoser, a king of the Third Dynasty, and his trusted architect, Imhotep. He was not just a builder, but a visionary, a physician, a priest, and a wise man whose figure was so admired that centuries later, he would be deified. Imhotep designed for Djoser a tomb unlike any before, a stepped pyramid rising in 6 levels over the necropolis of Saqqara. No longer was the tomb hidden in the depths of the earth, as had been the custom, but lifted toward the sky, like a sacred staircase to the stars. Djoser's pyramid was a bold experiment, a manifesto of architecture and faith. It was surrounded by a ceremonial complex with courtyards, temples, and labyrinthine corridors. Every element had a ritual purpose. Every wall spoke the language of the afterlife. The structure, made of finely carved limestone blocks, marked a turning point. A new type of funerary architecture had been born, and with it, a new way of understanding power. The pharaoh did not only reign in life, but also after death. Following Djoser's success, subsequent monarchs sought to go even further. Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, was one of the most innovative pharaohs in this regard. He ordered the construction of at least 3 pyramids during his reign. The first, in Meidum, suffered structural problems that caused it to partially collapse. The second, at Dashur, known as the Bent Pyramid, shows an abrupt change in the angle of its walls, a sign that they were still experimenting. But the third was a masterpiece, the Red Pyramid, also in Dashur, the first fully completed smooth-sided pyramid, and the direct predecessor of the giant pyramids of Giza. This knowledge, accumulated and perfected, reached its peak with Khufu, the son of Sneferu. Under his rule, the Great Pyramid was built, the largest of them all, originally standing more than 140 meters tall. That figure alone commands respect. But what truly astonishes is the process. Each stone block, some weighing several tons, was transported, carved, and assembled without the use of wheels, modern pulleys, or iron tools. It is estimated that the structure contains over 2 million blocks. There are no inscriptions inside to glorify the pharaoh, no decorative frescoes like in later tombs. It is a statement in stone, a perfect geometry built to outlast any word. Beside it rise the pyramids of Khafra and Menkaure, his descendants. Each has its own funerary complex, with temples, causeways, and sacred enclosures. And watching over it all, like a silent sculpted guardian, the Great Sphinx. A lion with a human face whose gaze has remained fixed on the horizon for more than 4,000 years. The Sphinx, worn down by centuries of sand and wind, remains one of the greatest enigmas of ancient Egypt. What does it represent? Whom does it portray? What secrets lie beneath its paws? Questions that have inspired theories of all kinds, from the most rigorous to the most fantastic. But while the architectural splendor is evident, what truly defines the pyramids is their symbolic weight. In the Egyptian mind, the pyramid shape represented the Benben, the primordial mound from which creation emerged according to the Heliopolitan cosmogony. Its tip, pointing to the sky, was an axis connecting the world of the living with that of the gods. Each pyramid was a microcosm, a sacred mountain whose function was to protect the king's body and facilitate his ascent to the stars, especially to the constellation of Orion, which was associated with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The construction of these colossal works required social and logistical organization without precedent. They were not built by chained slaves, as is still repeated in some popular accounts, but by thousands of specialized workers, well-fed and housed in nearby camps. There were masons, stonecutters, carpenters, cooks, priests. It was a national project that mobilized resources, knowledge, and faith. Because raising a pyramid was not merely a matter of stone, it was a spiritual endeavor, a sacred task that had to be carried out with near divine precision. As the centuries passed, the pyramids changed. They became smaller, more discreet, more integrated into the rock. The pharaohs began to bury themselves in the Valley of the Kings, west of Thebes, in hidden tombs decorated with complex funerary paintings. The pyramids, however, never lost their place in collective memory. They remained as symbols of the ancient order, of a golden age in which power was absolute, and the bond between gods and men seemed tangible. Today, as thousands of visitors walk the sands of Giza, as archaeologists continue to unearth their secret passages, the pyramids still speak. Not through words, but through their mere existence. They are witnesses to the passage of time, guardians of a world that still fascinates us, that still holds unresolved mysteries. Because what the ancient Egyptians built was not simply stacked stone. It was a promise. The promise that, in some way, it is possible to defy oblivion. And so, after contemplating these mountains for eternity, we enter the deepest part of the Egyptian soul. Because if the pharaoh's body rested beneath tons of stone, his spirit sailed among the gods. In the next chapter, we will descend into the heart of that complex and fascinating faith, the world of gods, magic, and myths that define the Egyptian vision of the universe. Religion awaits us. Gods of gold and flesh, religion and worldview. If one truly wants to enter the heart of ancient Egypt, to understand its colossal constructions, its meticulous rituals, its way of burying the dead, or of looking at the sky, one must leave behind modern categories of the sacred and the profane. Because in Egypt, religion was not just one aspect of life, it was life itself. The everyday and the eternal, the visible and the invisible, the grain that sprouts and the star that shines in the sky. Everything was intertwined by a network of sacred meanings that the Egyptians never stopped reading, interpreting, and honoring. And that network had a name, a deep rhythm. Mot. Balance. Order. Universal harmony. The Egyptian worldview did not arise from a sacred book or a doctrine imposed from above, but from constant observation of the natural world. The cycle of the Nile, the alternation of day and night, the death of the seed and its rebirth as a plant, the stars spinning with mathematical precision. All of it was living proof that the universe functioned like a complex, beautiful, and demanding machine, which had to be kept in its course in order not to fall into chaos. Mot was not an abstract concept. She was a goddess with feathers on her head, who presided over the judgment of souls and also inspired the laws of the Pharaohs. Whoever acted with justice, who respected the cycles, who fulfilled their ritual duties, was upholding the cosmos with their own hands. Within this universe, so symbolically dense, the Egyptian gods emerged not as distant figures, but as active, close presences, just as powerful as they were familiar. There were many, yes, more than 800 deities throughout history, but each had a precise role in the fabric of the world. And more than mere idols, they were living energies, capable of taking multiple forms, changing names, merging with one another. Some had animal faces and human bodies. Others were represented as animated hieroglyphs, as lights, as boats, as trees. Egyptian religion was never static. It was in constant evolution, shaped by myths, kings, regions, temples, and time. Among all the gods, some formed part of the oldest and most respected core. Ra, the sun god, was one of the pillars of theology. He traveled through the sky each day in his solar bark, illuminating the world. And at night he descended into the underworld to face chaos, in an eternal battle that he had to win so that the sunrise could happen again. This image, the god who fights to maintain order while everything threatens to fall apart, became a central metaphor of Egyptian life. The sun rose each morning not due to simple physics, but because Ra, with tireless courage, had once again defeated the darkness. Beside him, Osiris reigned over the dead and the fields of the afterlife. His myth, one of the richest in ancient Egypt, tells that he was murdered and dismembered by his brother Seth, and later resurrected by his wife Isis, who gathered his parts and breathed life back into him. From that mystical union was born Horus, the falcon, destined to avenge his father and inherit the throne of the world. This story, deeply human in its emotions of betrayal, grief, love, and redemption, served as a model for the cycle of death and rebirth, both physical and spiritual. The Egyptians did not see death as a tragic end, but as a continuation of the journey, a transition toward a higher state of existence. And that is why their funerary rituals were so meticulous. Preparing the body, preserving the name, equipping the deceased with offerings, spells, and magical protection was a way of ensuring that the journey to the afterlife would be successful. The judgment of the soul was the culmination of that journey. In the Hall of the Two Truths, the heart of the deceased was placed on a scale against the feather of Mot, the symbol of cosmic order. If the heart was heavier, laden with guilt or imbalance, it was devoured by a monstrous creature named Ammit, and the soul vanished forever. But if the scale remained balanced, the deceased was accepted into the realm of Osiris, where existence continued in an ideal version of earthly life. Fields of reeds, eternal harvests, abundance without pain. This promise upheld an ethic, a spirituality, and a deep hope. But the Egyptian gods were not confined to temples or the afterlife. They could be found in every aspect of daily life. Hathor, the celestial cow, protected women and musicians. Thoth, the wise ibis, was the patron of scribes, the guardian of secrets, and the inventor of writing. Bastet, the cat, brought harmony to the home, but could become the lioness Sekhmet when divine punishment was needed. Each god could manifest in contradictory, changing yet coherent forms. Because in Egypt, paradox was not a problem. It was a form of truth. Temples were the setting of this intimate relationship with the divine. Far from being merely places of prayer, they were true miniature worlds, designed as representations of the universe, with courtyards, columns, dark chambers, and hypostyle halls that imitated creation itself. Each temple was dedicated to a main god, but contained spaces for many others, reflecting the inclusive and plural nature of Egyptian religion. The priest was not a mediator between the people and the deity, but a servant of the god, responsible for bathing, dressing, feeding, and awakening the divine spirit each day. The rituals were long, secretive, marked by codified gestures and sacred formulas. Meanwhile, the people remained outside the sanctuary, worshipping from a distance, yet participating in processions, offerings, and festivals that animated the calendar with steady rhythm. And at the center of it all stood the Pharaoh. He was not merely a ruler, but a divine being, the son of Ra, the living Horus, the guarantor of Maat. His reign was not only political, it was cosmic. If the Pharaoh governed well, the Nile flowed generously, crops prospered, and enemies were vanquished. But if something failed, a drought, a plague, a rebellion, it was a sign that the balance was breaking, and that it had to be restored through rituals, sacrifices, or changes on the throne. Theology and power were intertwined with a firmness that allowed no separation. Politics was a religious act, and every action of the monarch had eternal consequences. Over the centuries, the pantheon expanded, reorganized itself, absorbed local deities, and adapted foreign beliefs. But the essence remained, a vision in which the divine is everywhere, where death does not inspire fear because it is a passage, and where the world must be constantly upheld by human hands that understand the weight of spiritual responsibility. Thus lived the Egyptians for over 3 millennia, in constant dialogue with their gods, among altars, stars, papyri, offerings, and spells. And although time buried temples and extinguished bloodlines, the voices of their gods still resonate in the stones they left behind. And now that we have crossed the spiritual universe that sustained their worldview, we must look to the other side of the mirror, when order wavers, when harmony breaks. Because the Egyptian balance, so carefully maintained, was not eternal. In the next chapter, the kingdom begins to crack, chaos emerges, and one of the darkest stages of this ancient history begins. The Crumbling Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the splendor of the Old Kingdom, with its pyramids rising toward the heavens, its pharaohs immortalized in stone, and its social balance sustained by a rigid worldview, did not last forever. What once seemed eternal, built with an almost divine will, began slowly to crack from within. It was not an abrupt fall nor a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual unraveling. Silent at first, then deeper and deeper, as if Egypt, exhausted from upholding its own greatness, began to yield under the weight of its own history. Thus began the first intermediate period, a dark, complex, and fascinating era that forever transformed the face of the Nile. For centuries, the pharaohs had ruled as living gods, concentrating absolute power in their hands. But that centralization, which had been the strength of the Old Kingdom, also became its weakness. As dynasties dragged on, internal tensions began to accumulate. The monumental expenses of pyramid construction had drained state resources. The nomarchs, regional governors, began acting with increasing autonomy, building their own tombs, raising their own armies, harboring their own dreams of power. The Nile, once a firm spine, became an artery fractured by disputes and rivalries. By the end of the reign of Pepi II, one of the longest reigning monarchs in history, the situation had become untenable. His authority was nominal, almost symbolic. He ruled for so long that he outlived nearly all his heirs. The power vacuum after his death opened the floodgates to total fragmentation. Dynasties multiplied like broken reflections. While some kings still claimed the title of Pharaoh from Memphis, other regional leaders proclaimed themselves sovereigns in their own lands. Egypt, once a near mystical unity, became a puzzle of minor kingdoms, in conflict with one another, without a shared vision to keep them united. The first intermediate period, roughly spanning from 2100 to 1930 BCE, was a time of shadows, but also of resilience. There are no grand pyramids or colossal monuments that survive from those years, and many of the historical sources are fragmented or written later. But within that apparent silence, within that void of central power, new voices blossomed. For the first time, texts began to reflect the anguish of the individual, the pain of the farmer, the disorientation of the scribe. Egyptian literature, which until then had focused on the ritualistic and the majestic, began to turn inward, almost philosophical. One of the most haunting texts of this period is The Lamentations of Ipuwer, a poem steeped in despair that depicts an upside-down world. The poor now possess riches, the wealthy beg in the streets, the dead lie unburied, the Nile has changed course, justice has vanished. While some scholars believe this text may be a later literary creation with symbolic overtones, its tone accurately reflects a deep crisis in the Egyptian imagination. It was not just a political collapse. It was the sense that Ma'at, the cosmic order, had been shattered. While chaos overtook Memphis and its surroundings in the north, a new center of stability began to emerge in the south, the city of Thebes. From there, a lineage of rulers known as the Intefs, and later the Mentuhoteps, began consolidating power, forging religious ties with temples, and slowly restoring central authority. This gradual reconquest of order was not executed coldly. It required strategy, diplomacy, and, when necessary, violence. The Thebans understood that if Egypt was to be whole again, it was necessary not only to rebuild political structures, but also to restore the spiritual confidence that had once united the peoples of the Nile. During this stage, the image of the pharaoh began to shift. He was no longer merely an untouchable god, but a leader with concrete duties to his people. The tombs of officials began to show more human scenes, families, banquets, daily life. The idea of immortality slowly became democratized. It was no longer only the king who could aspire to eternal life, but also high officials, scribes, and citizens who had the means to afford proper burial. Access to eternity became more horizontal, more plural, and with that, Egyptian society began to reinvent itself from the bottom up. This period of fragmentation, far from being just a time of decline, was also a laboratory for profound change. The provinces, no longer under constant central control, developed their own cultural identities, artistic styles, and forms of local organization. Funerary architecture diversified, religious texts were copied with regional variations, and new religious expressions emerged, many of which would later be absorbed by the empire when it resurged. In essence, the chaos of these centuries was also a time of fertility. Like fields after an irregular Nile flood, Egypt had to be reseeded from its roots. Finally, after decades of conflict, simmering tensions, and gradual conquests, a name emerged forcefully in history: Mentuhotep II. This Theban king, a skilled military leader and devoted follower of the god Amun, achieved what many before him had attempted in vain, reunifying the country under a single scepter. His victory was more than a military feat. It was a symbolic act of restoring cosmic order. Egypt once again breathed under a single sun, and while the old kingdom was gone, it gave way to a new era, the Middle Kingdom. And so, from the ruins of disorder, Egypt rose once again, with new sensibilities, a new understanding of power, and renewed confidence in its destiny. For Egypt, though fractured, was never truly defeated. It lay hidden in its villages, in its lesser temples, in its melancholic texts. It waited, like grain beneath dry earth, for the right moment to be reborn. And it would be reborn. Because in the next chapter, we'll see how Mentuhotep and his successors forged a stronger, wiser, more humane Egypt. An empire that, without abandoning its sacred roots, would learn to look to the future with a mix of prudence, ambition, and beauty. The time of the Middle Kingdom begins. The Lotus Reborn, the Middle Kingdom. When chaos had seemingly become Egypt's new natural state, when unity was but a memory, and the Nile flowed between territories ruled by competing interests, something unexpected began to take shape in the south. In Thebes, where temples breathed among sun-warmed hills and the waters flowed with a near-ritual murmur, a new political, religious, and military force slowly consolidated, with patience, but with determination. From this firm ground in Upper Egypt emerged Mentuhotep II, a king whose vision went beyond reclaiming lost territory. He sought to restore the balance of the Egyptian world, like one attempting to repair a millennia-old vessel shattered into 1,000 fragments. His victory over the northern lords did more than reunify the country. It reopened the path toward a new era of splendor, introspection, and harmony. Thus was born the Middle Kingdom. This period, which historians place roughly between 2006 and 1780 before Common Era, marked an age of political maturity and artistic sensitivity, in which the Egyptian state reinvented itself without losing sight of its roots. Unlike the Old Kingdom, dominated by monumentality and the absolutism of the God-King, the Middle Kingdom proposed a more practical model, more organized, closer to the citizen. Power was still concentrated in the figure of the pharaoh, yes, but now supported by an efficient administration, a well-defined hierarchy, and a political system that skillfully combined strength with stability. It was a time of national reconstruction, and as with all deep rebuilding, it required more than armies. It required ideas. Mentuhotep II, whose tomb at Deir el-Bahari stands as a testament to his restrained ambition, understood that unity alone was not enough. It had to be sustained and institutionalized. He strengthened the role of temples, reorganized the military, and curtailed the authority of the regional governors who had played such a key role in the previous collapse. The balance between Thebes and Memphis became more delicate, but also more efficient. For the first time in centuries, Egypt once again spoke with a single voice, and that voice was not only political, it was also cultural. Egyptian literature flourished during the Middle Kingdom with unprecedented depth. Texts like The Eloquent Peasant and The Tale of Sinuhe reflect a level of introspection, irony, and sensitivity not seen in earlier periods. These were stories where morality, justice, and the human condition took center stage. In Sinuhe, for example, we follow a courtier who flees the country after the pharaoh's death out of fear, lives in exile among foreign peoples, and eventually feels an overwhelming need to return to his homeland, to be buried in Egyptian soil. This longing for home, to close the cycle in peace with the gods, reveals a more intimate, more human worldview, where spirituality was no longer confined to the throne but extended to the anonymous individual. At the same time, the art and architecture of the period adopted a sober, more refined style, less monumental than that of the Old Kingdom, but rich in expressive detail. The statues of the 12th dynasty pharaohs, such as those of Senusret III, bear serious, even melancholic features, conveying an image of thoughtful kingship, a ruler burdened by the responsibility of governance. Gone was the quest for unshakable idealization. In its place came a kind of symbolic realism, where the king was not merely a god, but a man with a transcendent mission. Economically, the Middle Kingdom launched major hydraulic projects, reinforced irrigation systems, and expanded agricultural frontiers into the Fayum oasis, transforming the region into a true garden of grains, grapes, and papyrus. Agriculture returned to the center of Egyptian life, but now with more rational planning and greater awareness of environmental limits and possibilities. Foreign expeditions also multiplied. Trade routes opened to Nubia, from which gold flowed northward, and contact with the Levant intensified, bringing not only goods, but also new ideas, techniques, and symbols. The 12th dynasty pharaohs, especially Amenemhat I and Senusret I, continued Mentuhotep's work by consolidating the state's structures and expanding Egypt's borders southward. Amenemhat moved the capital to Ichtawi, in a strategic location near the Fayum, allowing better control over both Upper and Lower Egypt. This apparently technical decision was also a declaration of intent. Egypt's throne must lie at the center of everything, geographically and symbolically. Senusret, for his part, stood out for his military campaigns in Nubia and Asia, but also for his ability to maintain internal peace and his generosity toward temples and local communities. It was during this era that the god Amun began to rise in prominence. As protector of Thebes, his cult gradually grew until it became a pillar of state religion. The priests of Amun amassed wealth, land, and prestige, eventually becoming a parallel power within the system. Though this ascent would later lead to tensions between temple and crown, during the Middle Kingdom this sacred alliance functioned as a powerful ideological foundation for the unity of the realm. Funerary architecture also underwent a notable evolution. Although pyramids continued to be built, they were smaller, more discreet, often covered with earth and surrounded by the tombs of officials and nobles. Burial chambers were decorated with the coffin texts, a collection of spells and prayers that expanded on the earlier pyramid texts, now allowing people outside the royal family to access the magical knowledge needed to reach the afterlife. Death, as in other periods, remained a journey, a transition, but it was now more accessible, more widely shared. However, by the end of the Middle Kingdom, signs of weakening began to emerge. The final generations of pharaohs gradually lost control over the provinces. The borders became blurry, and new players emerged in the Nile Delta, soon challenging the established order. The carefully built balance began, once again, to fracture. But the legacy of the Middle Kingdom went beyond temples, tombs, or texts. It left behind a way of governing, a social sensibility, and a political intelligence that would influence every later stage of Egyptian history. For the lotus that had once bloomed again in the muddy waters of the past did not vanish. Its roots remained alive, embedded in the fertile silt of memory. And although the country would soon once again divide, be invaded, and turn against itself, the lessons of the Middle Kingdom would endure as a silent legacy. The next chapter leads us to an unexpected crossroads, the time of the Hyksos, the foreigners who breached Egypt's walls and claimed thrones where they had never been invited. But it is also the beginning of another transformation, because Egypt, even in its darkest moments, never stopped moving, never stopped reinventing itself. Caravans of the desert, trade and diplomacy. While the Nile River set the internal rhythm of Egypt and sustained the life blooming on either side of its banks, beyond the desert's edge, past the red mountains and scorching seas of sand, another world unfolded, one of trade routes, oases, and distant horizons. There, among caravans laden with perfumes, precious metals, and foreign words, Egypt opened itself to the unknown. Though we often picture this civilization as enclosed within its temples and hieroglyphs, ancient Egypt was, from very early times, a dynamic actor in the networks of exchange that shaped the ancient world. A kingdom that, without losing its identity, looked beyond the desert, crossed borders, and built relationships that went far beyond the spiritual. At that intersection where trade meets diplomacy and geography meets politics, a fascinating dimension of pharaonic Egypt came into bloom. As early as the Middle Kingdom, and even more intensely during the New Kingdom, the pharaohs understood that a nation's wealth was measured not only in full granaries and eternal monuments, but also in its ability to acquire what it lacked: exotic woods, incense, ivory, lapis lazuli, animal skins, oil, copper, foreign wine, essences, animals, and precious stones. Egypt was richly blessed with agricultural resources thanks to the Nile, but it lacked many raw materials essential to its cultural and military expansion. This need compelled it to look outward, to chart routes through the desert, to organize expeditions, and to establish ties with peoples who did not share Egypt's gods, language, or architecture, but who did share a common interest: exchange. One of the most enigmatic and coveted destinations for the Egyptians was Punt, a mysterious land whose precise location remains debated by archaeologists today, perhaps on the Red Sea coast, in the Horn of Africa, or even farther south. Punt was regarded as a land blessed by the gods, a place of abundance and marvels, described in texts and reliefs with an almost mythological tone. In the time of Queen Hatshepsut, during the New Kingdom, one of the most famous expeditions to Punt was organized. The bas-reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict scenes of ships sailing across the sea, merchants trading goods, and even myrrh trees being brought back with their roots to be planted in Egypt. This expedition was not merely a commercial mission. It was a declaration of power and sophistication, a theatrical statement showing both the world and the Egyptians themselves that the pharaoh ruled not only Egypt, but could extend their influence to unseen, distant lands essential to their prestige. Closer to home, but no less important, were the routes that led to Nubia, south of the Egyptian heartland. This region, rich in gold, ebony, and slaves, was long both partner and subject. Egypt's relationship with Nubia was complex, at times marked by conquest and violence, at others by cultural assimilation and cooperation. Through strategic fortresses like Buhen or Semna, the Egyptians controlled the flow of goods, monitored local tribes, and secured caravan routes. Nubia was not only a source of material wealth, but also a symbolic space marking the boundary between Egyptian order and wild lands beyond. To dominate Nubia was to affirm that Mat, cosmic order, extended even beyond the cataracts of the Nile. To the east, desert routes connected Egypt with the mines of the Sinai Peninsula, especially prized for their turquoise and copper. Expeditions to these areas were carefully organized. Groups of workers, soldiers, and scribes were sent with supplies, pack animals, and ritual permissions. For extracting minerals was not merely an economic task. It was also a spiritual act. Offerings were made to local deities, and events were recorded in rock inscriptions. The Sinai landscape is scattered with these short texts, formal graffiti left by workers marking their passage, their achievements, their fears. The desert was a liminal space, heavy with both physical and spiritual dangers. On the Mediterranean coast, Egypt maintained regular contact with the regions of Canaan, Syria, and Phoenicia. Overland, and by sea, caravans brought luxury goods from cities that thrived in what is now Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel. Cedarwood, in particular, was vital for constructing ships, temples, and coffins. In return, Egypt exported agricultural products, high-quality linen, ceramics, papyrus, and its most coveted treasure, gold. The Amarna letters, discovered in the 20th century, reveal that these relationships were about much more than trade. In them, the kings of various Levantine city-states write to the pharaoh in tones of supplication, gratitude, or subtle diplomacy. They speak of gifts, royal marriages, and careful displays of loyalty. Egypt appears in this context as a skilled diplomatic power, able to exert influence without always needing to draw the sword. Indeed, diplomacy was one of the greatest accomplishments of the Egyptian political machine during its imperial era. The pharaoh did not simply negotiate with neighboring kings. He was keenly aware of his symbolic weight and used it to uphold a delicate international balance. The image of the monarch as the center of the universe, the sole legitimate interlocutor of the gods, reinforced Egypt's place on the geopolitical stage. Through the exchange of embassies, letters, tributes, and royal marriages, Egypt wove a network of relationships that allowed it to secure key resources without the constant drain of military campaigns. Foreign princesses arrived at the Theban court as guarantees of peace, but also as bearers of new customs, accents, and perspectives that, while never overturning the Egyptian core, enriched it with fresh nuances. Internally, these commercial activities required a complex logistical apparatus. Caravans were never improvised. They demanded meticulous planning, seasonal calendars, safe routes, and above all, protection. The Egyptian state, centralized and efficient, guaranteed this security through garrisons, watchtowers, and supply stations. The desert routes, which may seem empty at a glance, were in fact living arteries through which not only merchandise moved, but also information, rumors, languages, and stories. For wherever there are roads, there is encounter. And where there is encounter, there is change. This open, curious, adaptive Egypt does not contradict the solemn image of sacred Egypt. It completes it. At its most intimate core, Egyptian culture was always a balance of preservation and integration. They preserved their rites, their language, their architecture, and their gods. But they knew how to absorb what was useful, reinterpret the foreign, and integrate it into their symbolic universe without losing their center. Trade and diplomacy were not isolated actions. They were deliberate gestures of openness, strategic bets on a sustainable future. And so, among caravans crossing hot sand, ships cutting through unknown seas, and scrolls carried from one court to another, Egypt expanded its world without ceasing to be Egypt. An empire of stone and papyrus that knew how to look beyond its borders with intelligence, prudence, and deep confidence in its own worth. On the horizon, however, new tensions were beginning to form. The stability that had allowed this flourishing would not last forever. New peoples, new weapons, and new forms of power were about to erupt onto the stage. In the next chapter, we enter one of the most intense episodes of this millennia-old story: the arrival of the Hyksos, foreigners who seized the throne of the Nile. Invasion and resistance, the Hyksos. For centuries, the Egyptians had seen their land as the center of the ordered world, an island of stability and wisdom surrounded by seas of chaos. Their worldview was anchored in the certainty that Egypt was eternal, inviolable, protected by the gods and by the harmony of Ma'at. But at some point, that bubble of security burst. The heart of the Nile was pierced by peoples who came from the north, from distant shores and foreign landscapes, bearing strange customs, new weapons, and a language that did not sound like the ancestral Egyptian tongue. Thus began the dark times of the Second Intermediate Period. And at the center of this episode stands a name that echoed as a symbol of humiliation and threat for generations: the Hyksos. The word Hyksos derives from the Egyptian term Hatshepsut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. It does not refer to a single unified people, but to a coalition of Semitic groups who began settling in the eastern Nile Delta toward the end of the Middle Kingdom, around 1700 before Common Era. At first, their arrival was gradual, almost invisible. Traders, nomadic herders, laborers offering their strength in a weakened Egypt. But over time, these groups organized, gained military and economic power, and filled the power vacuums left by the last pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. Their decisive moment came when they conquered Avaris, a port city in the Delta, which they turned into their capital. From there, the Hyksos expanded their control over the north of the country, founding what is now known as the 15th Dynasty. They proclaimed themselves pharaohs, adopted elements of Egyptian ceremonial life, respected certain traditional cults, but maintained their own cultural identity. They introduced new weapons such as the composite bow, the curved sword, and most significantly, the horse-drawn war chariot. an innovation that would forever change the way war was waged in Egypt. Though they did not destroy temples or outlaw local cults, their presence was perceived as an affront, a deep disturbance in the natural cycle of the world. For the Egyptians of the south, especially those in Thebes, this occupation meant more than a territorial loss. It was a spiritual wound, an offense to the very principle of Maat. The Nile was split in two. The delta had fallen into foreign hands, and only Upper Egypt remained under native control. Resistance was neither immediate nor organized. For decades, the Theban dynasties coexisted uneasily with the Hyksos, maintaining a tense truce, exchanging tributes and ambassadors, lacking the strength to reclaim the country by force. But beneath the surface, resentment grew. Texts from the period evoke that restrained anger, that wounded pride which would slowly transform into a fierce will to reconquer. It was then that a figure emerged who would change the course of events. Seqenenretau, a Theban prince who, it seems, died in battle, likely facing the Hyksos. His mummy, discovered centuries later, bears terrible cranial wounds, deep cuts, brutal blows, a silent violence that still speaks through petrified flesh. His death was not in vain. It marked the beginning of a struggle that his son Thutmose would continue with even greater resolve, launching military campaigns that gradually pushed the Hyksos northward. Thutmose understood that war was not just about battles, it was about symbols. In his proclamations, he expressed scorn for the Asiatics who had usurped the land of the Nile and his determination to return Egypt to Egyptian hands. War for him was an act of purification, of restoring divine balance. But it was with Ahmose I, Thutmose's younger brother, that resistance turned into victory. Ahmose was young when he inherited the Theban crown, but he had strategic clarity and a long-term vision. He reorganized the army, reinforced supply lines, and most importantly, assimilated the technologies his enemies had brought. He learned from them in order to defeat them. With war chariots and disciplined soldiers, Ahmose launched a series of swift campaigns that culminated in the fall of Avaris. The Hyksos were expelled not only from the delta, but chased into Canaan, where the Egyptians ensured they could not regroup or return. This moment marked a definitive turning point. Egypt did not merely regain political unity, it recovered its dignity, its identity, its place in the world. Ahmose's victory was not celebrated merely as a military triumph. It was hailed as a cosmic restoration. Maat had been re-established. The gods once again walked among their temples. And the Egyptian people, having survived an unprecedented invasion, emerged stronger, with a new awareness of their vulnerability and their capacity to respond. The Hyksos left an ambiguous legacy in Egyptian history. They were enemies, yes, but also the unintended bearers of progress. They introduced technical, military, and organizational elements that the Egyptians adopted and perfected. Their presence forced Egypt to adapt, to modernize, to think differently. The war against them was not just a battle for land. It was a battle for the soul of a civilization that, after humiliation, dared to reinvent itself. With the expulsion of the Hyksos and the crowning of Ahmose I as the new unifier of the land, begins the period known as the New Kingdom, the era of greatest military expansion, imperial glory, and colossal construction. Egypt would no longer be a kingdom enclosed within its sacred borders. It had learned that to survive, it must look beyond its temples, dominate before being dominated, strike before the threat approached. But before the gates of empire open wide, this chapter leaves us with a profound lesson. Even the darkest moments of disorder, fear, and disruption can become the starting point for renewal. The presence of the Hyksos forced Egypt to define itself more clearly, to fight with greater conviction, and to be reborn. Because in Egyptian history, rebirth is no accident. It is a constant. And in the next chapter, that rebirth will take imperial form. With Thutmose I leading the way, the new kingdom will rise from the rubble of the past and usher in the age of great conquerors, majestic temples, and pharaoh queens. An Egypt that not only resisted, but learned how to conquer. The rise of the empire, the new kingdom begins. After the ashes of invasion, after years of humiliation and resistance, Egypt awoke with a clarity of purpose it had not known in centuries. The expulsion of the Hyksos was not merely a territorial victory, it was the founding act of a new era. The country, wounded but undefeated, had learned that isolation could be just as dangerous as an armed enemy, and that if it wished to endure, it had to change. Thus was born the New Kingdom, a period that not only marked the resurgence of ancient splendor, but a complete reinvention of what it meant to be Egypt. An Egypt that no longer contented itself with defending its borders, but now looked outward to the world. An imperial Egypt. The New Kingdom, which spanned approximately from 1550 to 1070 before Common Era, is considered by many to be the pinnacle of pharaonic civilization, a period of extraordinary wealth, unprecedented military expansion, and artistic, architectural, and religious production of overwhelming beauty. In this new cycle, Egypt not only restored its internal unity, but projected its influence far beyond its traditional boundaries, becoming an international power with allies, enemies, and colonies stretching from the Euphrates to the fourth cataract of the Nile. The figure who set this great machinery in motion was Ahmose I, founding king of the 18th dynasty. After defeating the Hyksos, he consolidated power from Thebes and established a strong monarchy backed by a renewed army, a centralized administration, and an allied clergy. His reign was not just a starting point, it was a political program, securing the southern frontier in Nubia, pacifying the delta, reinforcing eastern defenses, and crucially, rebuilding the temples that had been neglected or plundered during the interregnum. For the pharaoh's power was sustained not only by weapons, but by his role as guarantor of sacred order, Mat, in whose name not just laws, but entire cities were built. With peace restored, Egypt quickly turned to the offensive. His successors, especially Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, launched military campaigns beyond what their predecessors had ever imagined possible. They conquered lands in Asia, subdued kingdoms in Syria and Palestine, and strengthened control over Nubia. The spoils of war were not only material, they included slaves, artisans, exotic animals, and even noble hostages brought to Egypt to be educated in the Theban style. War became a tool of diplomacy, propaganda, and cultural expansion. It was also a form of political theater. Each victory was celebrated as a reaffirmation of divine order, and the pharaoh appeared not only as strategist, but as executor of the god's will. During this period, the figure of the pharaoh became more complex, more refined, more monumental. Colossal statues portraying him took on an almost mystical presence. The serene face, the gaze fixed on infinity, the restrained muscles, as if carved in an eternal moment. Art ceased to be mere glorification of power and became a sophisticated expression of control, spirituality, and political vision. Tombs, for their part, abandoned the pyramidal shape and were moved to the Valley of the Kings, a hidden place among harsh mountains, where monarchs were buried in hypogea decorated with scenes from the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. There, in passages covered with stars, serpents, and spells, the king's journey toward immortality was told. Thebes, spiritual and political center of the New Kingdom, transformed into a sacred capital, home to the cult of Amun, the god who became the most powerful symbol of this new era. The Temple of Karnak grew into the largest religious complex of the ancient world, a true forest of columns and obelisks where each pharaoh left their mark, their reliefs, their stories. Amun-Ra, a fusion of the solar god and the Theban god, now stood as the protector of the empire, the divine father of the king, the recipient of offerings arriving from every conquered corner. The power of Amun's clergy grew alongside the thrones, and for a long time, that symbiosis functioned as the backbone of the state. Egyptian society also underwent a transformation. The army, traditionally made up of native Egyptians, began to incorporate Nubian, Libyan, and Asiatic mercenaries. Scribes, increasingly specialized, kept detailed records of trade, taxes, and tributes. Urban middle classes expanded, driven by administration and the construction boom. Women, while lacking formal political power, exerted notable influence, especially at court. Philosophical texts, novels, and wisdom literature were written, reflecting a more individual sensitivity, more aware of the passage of time, of duty, of legacy. But if one thing defines the new kingdom, it is its relationship with the outside world. Egypt ceased to be a self-contained kingdom and became a global player. Diplomacy became professionalized, embassies multiplied, and marriage alliances turned into key pieces on the geopolitical chessboard. The Amarna archive, discovered in the 20th century, shows us how the kings of Mitanni, Babylon, and Hatti exchanged letters with the pharaoh, called him brother, sent him lavish gifts, and requested daughters in marriage to seal peace. In those clay tablets, written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the time, we discover an Egypt that negotiates, seduces, imposes, but also listens, hesitates, calculates. As the new kingdom progressed, its splendor became almost excessive. Tombs grew deeper, temples more vast, rituals more complex. The court swelled with officials, advisors, artists, and at times, intrigue. For power, when it accumulates too much, also casts shadows. But that shadow has not yet arrived. For now, we are at the peak. At the moment when everything seems possible. At the precise instant when Egypt believes itself eternal, invulnerable, destined to rule over all known peoples of the earth. And in that scene of grandeur, extraordinary figures will emerge. Queens who will defy tradition. Kings who will dare to change religion. Generals who will cross the Euphrates to battle the most powerful empires of the world. For the new kingdom is still rising, and its story, far from fading, is just beginning to shine with the intensity of a sun at its zenith. The next chapter will be the first of many where we glimpse the human face of this golden age, and we'll do so through the story of a woman who changed the course of history, the queen who dressed as a pharaoh, who built temples, traced trade routes, and defied all without moving a single army. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her legacy still speaks to us from the stone walls, thousands of years later. Hatshepsut, the woman who became pharaoh. In a world ruled by tradition, where every gesture, every word, every structure obeyed centuries of ritual repetition, defying the rules was more than audacity. It was a declaration against eternity. And yet that is precisely what Hatshepsut did. In a kingdom carved by the hands of men, in a culture that placed the pharaoh at the peak of a hierarchical and masculine cosmos, she refused to wield power from the shadows or settle for the role of regent. She chose to take the throne, to wield the symbols of royalty, to adopt the masculine iconography of the divine monarch, and to claim for herself the title that only a few had borne before her, Pharaoh of Egypt. Her reign, which lasted more than 2 decades, was not a brief transition or a passing anomaly, but one of the most prosperous, intelligent, and visually stunning eras of the New Kingdom. Her name, though later erased from official records, never completely disappeared. Hatshepsut left her mark in stone and gold, in carved words, in monuments as grand as the idea she dared to embody. Daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose, Hatshepsut was born into the royal lineage and received a privileged education, surrounded by scribes, priests, and architects. From a young age, she demonstrated strong character, sharp intelligence, and a deep connection to temple rituals. Her father, confident in her abilities, prepared her for a prominent role, although the crown was not something she would receive by direct right. Egypt, even in its mystical complexity, followed a patriarchal logic of succession. And when Thutmose I died, the throne passed to his son Thutmose II, Hatshepsut's half-brother, whom she married, as was customary in the royal house, to reinforce dynastic legitimacy. When Thutmose II died prematurely, power fell into the hands of an heir who was too young. Thutmose III, son of the late Pharaoh and a secondary concubine. Hatshepsut, as royal wife and aunt of the boy, initially assumed the role of regent. But what began as a temporary responsibility gradually became a silent conquest of the throne. Through a careful and gradual process, Hatshepsut accumulated the titles of power, strengthened her alliances with the priesthood of Amun, and in a masterstroke, had herself depicted in statues and reliefs with male attributes, royal headdress, false beard, and a sculpted body like that of any previous pharaoh. But the most important thing was not how she appeared, it was how she ruled. During her reign, Egypt experienced a period of stability, economic development, and architectural splendor. There are no records of major military campaigns, but there is abundant evidence of public works, temples, and re-established trade routes. It was a time of consolidation, of internal growth, of aesthetic refinement. Hatshepsut understood power as an art to be exercised with strategic intelligence and an enveloping narrative. Rather than imposing her figure through force of arms, she chose to do so by constructing symbols. And her masterpiece was undoubtedly the funerary temple of Deir el-Bahari, an absolute jewel embedded in the cliffs of the western bank of Thebes. Designed by her trusted architect Senenmut, the temple of Deir el-Bahari is far more than a tomb. It is a statement of greatness, harmony, and legitimacy. Its architecture, based on symmetrical terraces, open colonnades, and ramps that seem to merge with the mountain, reflects an almost modern sensibility. Its walls recount fundamental episodes of her reign: the expedition to Punt, the divine coronation, the sacred lineage. Everything was conceived so that visitors would understand that Hatshepsut was not an usurper, but someone chosen by the gods. One of the most fascinating stories she ordered to be carved was that of her divine birth. In it, the god Amun, disguised as King Thutmose I, visits her mother and conceives the future queen. The message is clear. Her right to the throne came not from chance nor from politics, but from the very celestial realm. This deeply symbolic tale revealed both her ambition and her understanding of the Egyptian ideological apparatus. She knew that a reign was not sustained solely with laws and soldiers, but with narratives that wove reality with the threads of eternity. But beyond the propaganda, Hatshepsut's concrete achievements were numerous. During her rule, trade routes were reactivated, especially the maritime route to Punt, which brought exotic riches such as myrrh, ebony, ivory, and gold. The art of her time reached exceptional levels of refinement. The sculptures depicting her show a unique transition between feminine and masculine, between delicacy and strength. In her earliest representations, she appears as a woman, with long dresses and soft features, but little by little she adopts the iconography of the pharaoh, until by the middle of her reign, her image is indistinguishable from that of any male monarch. This duality was managed with impressive political skill, without causing internal wars or visible fractures in the administration. However, after her death, her legacy was partially erased. Thutmose III, now an adult and finally in full control of power, launched a systematic campaign to eliminate traces of her reign. Her name was scraped from stelae, her statues mutilated, her reliefs destroyed or buried. This was not simply an act of vengeance. It was a way to restore the traditional dynastic order, to correct history. The existence of a female pharaoh had been such a deep challenge to the Egyptian symbolic structure that it could only be tolerated while she was alive. Once dead, her figure had to be adjusted, neutralized, absorbed by silence. but silence was never total. The ruins of her temple resisted the passage of time. Some records remained hidden under new layers of stone, and modern archaeologists, upon discovering her works, her tombs, her inscriptions, understood that they were in the presence of an exceptional figure, ahead of her time, capable of wielding the tools of power with an elegance few men ever achieved. Hatshepsut was not an anomaly. She was the demonstration that Egyptian history, even in its most rigid structures, could open a crack to the unexpected. Her reign is a testament to how power, when exercised with intelligence, can become a bridge between order and innovation, between the eternal and the possible. And like every bridge, its existence allows one to cross to the other side. Because what comes next, after her death and the rise of Thutmose III's absolute rule, is an age of unrestrained conquest, of military campaigns that will take the Egyptian army to the gates of Asia. The young prince who lived for years in the shadow of a queen will become the greatest strategist Egypt has ever known. In the next chapter, the empire expands and the Nile becomes a sword. Times of war and gods, Thutmose III, and total expansion. When Thutmose III finally took the reins of power, he had more than ambition. He carried the weight of a legacy that had been denied to him for more than 2 decades. His aunt and stepmother, Hatshepsut, the great queen who had defied the traditional order to rule as pharaoh, had kept him in the shadows, relegated to a symbolic role while she built temples and trade routes with the same firmness with which she had claimed the throne. Thutmose grew up in forced silence, learning to wait, to observe, to understand that power is not always seized by force, but that when it is recovered, it must be wielded with absolute determination. And that is exactly what he did. With his full ascension to the throne, Egypt entered a new phase, more aggressive, more expansive, more militarized. The empire was on the move, and he would be its hammer and its shield. The reign of Thutmose III marked the height of Egyptian territorial power. Under his command, the army became a precise and formidable machine, capable of crossing deserts, scaling mountains, and confronting enemies who, until then, had remained beyond Egypt's reach. The campaigns he led were not mere triumphal marches. They were complex expeditions, designed with strategy, patience, and brutal efficiency. In total, 17 military campaigns in Asia are attributed to him, led either personally or under his direct supervision, making him one of the most active commanders in all of ancient history. The first and most famous of these campaigns was the Battle of Megiddo in Canaan, a battle that would define his reputation. The city-states of the Levant, united in a coalition led by the king of Kadesh, had rebelled against Egyptian influence. Thutmose responded with relentless speed. He crossed the Sinai Desert with a well-supplied army and, in an unexpected move, chose the most difficult and risky route to attack Megiddo by surprise. The maneuver proved decisive. The enemy, caught off guard, was defeated and fled behind the city walls. The siege lasted for months, but eventually, Megiddo fell. The spoils were vast: weapons, war chariots, livestock, and most importantly, noble hostages whose bloodlines would guarantee the region's loyalty. The victory at Megiddo was not only a military triumph, it was a statement. Egypt would not tolerate disloyalty, and Thutmose was not a ruler of hesitant gestures. He was a full-fledged emperor. From that moment on, his figure grew to legendary proportions. Campaigns followed year after year, pushing the Egyptian frontier as far as the Euphrates River, clashing with Mitanni, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the region. Each victory was commemorated with inscriptions, reliefs, and stone columns recounting the number of enemies slain, the tributes obtained, and the gods invoked before battle. Because in Egyptian thought, war was not only a political action, it was a sacred act. Each battle won was a restoration of Maat, the cosmic order, which had to be imposed over foreign chaos. Thutmose himself appears in records as the victorious bull, the falcon of the south, names that refer both to his physical strength and his divine connection. In Karnak, he ordered a series of reliefs to be carved in the so-called Hall of Annals, where each campaign is listed one by one with almost obsessive precision. There is no gratuitous epic exaggeration there, only administration, calculation, documentation. Because the Egyptian empire at this stage was as much a network of tribute as it was a chain of temples, as much a projection of power as an international economy. The conquered cities sent their due every year: precious metals, livestock, wood, soldiers, artisans. Egypt became the center of a constellation of peoples connected by both force and diplomacy. But Thutmose was not only a warrior. He was also a reformer, a builder, a patron of the arts. During his reign, Thebes reached unprecedented magnificence. The Temple of Amun in Karnak was expanded, decorated, and consecrated with new obelisks, statues, and columns. There, among the cool shadows of the hypostyle halls, one could feel the very breath of the gods. Thutmose understood that power had to be reflected in stone, in architecture, in permanence. His constructions blended sobriety with grandeur, balance with strength. The king was on campaign, but his legacy also grew along the banks of the Nile, where temples served as both religious symbols and administrative and economic centers. The religiosity of Thutmose III was expressed with the same seriousness as his military career. He presented himself as the chosen of Amun, the executor of his will on earth. Offerings to the gods multiplied, as did the festivals and ceremonies that reinforced the unity of the state. Amun-Ra, in particular, was enthroned as the supreme deity, the solar and Theban father who guaranteed Egypt's destiny. This bond between the throne and the Temple of Karnak became one of the keys to the empire's stability. As the pharaoh expanded the territory with his sword, the priests wove the sacred narrative that made him necessary, inevitable, immortal. Internally, the country experienced tangible prosperity. The gold of Nubia flowed like a current parallel to the Nile. Trade routes were protected, granaries were full, and artisans were busy. Exotic goods were imported from every corner of the known world. And while soldiers marched northward, scribes recorded every expense, every decree, every movement. Egyptian bureaucracy, the result of centuries of centralized administration, was the invisible gear that kept the empire turning with precision. By the end of his life, Thutmose III was no longer merely a powerful king. He was a living legend. In his tomb, carved into the Valley of the Kings, the walls are covered with the Book of Amduat, a sacred text that describes the pharaoh's journey through the underworld. There are no battle scenes there, no gestures of arrogance. There is cosmic reflection, a meditation on the cycle of death and rebirth. Because even the greatest conqueror had to face the judgment of the gods, had to cross the dark waters of the Duat, and rise again as a star in the sky of the west. The legacy of Thutmose III is multifaceted. He was the king who consolidated the empire in its fullest form, who made Egypt a superpower of the ancient East. He was the strategist who led his armies beyond any imagined frontier. He was the devotee of the gods, the tireless builder, the ruler who turned conquest into a form of order. And despite the passing of the centuries, his figure stands clear along the thread of history. But Egyptian history is not a straight line. After the sword comes the whisper. After the marching empire comes the rupture of dogma. Because the next pharaoh, heir to this machinery of power, will not seek more lands nor more tributes, but rather a spiritual revolution. In the next chapter, we will dive into one of the strangest and most radical decisions in all of antiquity. The Amarna Revolution, the time of the pharaoh who erased the gods. His name was Akhenaten, and nothing was ever the same again. The Sun Heretic, Akhenaten and the Amarna Revolution. In the midst of Egypt's golden age, when temples rose like stone jungles, when borders stretched across Asia and Africa, and the gods were worshipped with almost mathematical devotion, something utterly unexpected happened. Something unlike anything Egypt had ever seen before, or would ever see again. Suddenly, at the very heart of one of the most orthodox and conservative powers in ancient history, a pharaoh emerged who broke with everything, with images, with formulas, with temples, with priests, with the very gods who had formed the backbone of the Egyptian universe for centuries. A pharaoh who defied time and dogma, who reinvented himself and sought to reinvent the entire country. His name was Amenhotep IV, though he would soon abandon it. He preferred to be called Akhenaten, and his revolution, both spiritual and aesthetic, remains one of the most baffling and fascinating episodes of ancient history. From birth, Amenhotep IV belonged to a solid and well-established royal lineage. Son of Amenhotep III, one of the most opulent monarchs of the New Kingdom, he was raised amidst luxury, tradition, and a highly efficient administration. Yet from the earliest years of his reign, something in him began to veer off course. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a heightened attention to Aten, the solar disk, a simplification of religious rituals, a slightly altered way of presenting his image in reliefs. Then, that deviation became a rupture, and eventually, a total revolution. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, the one who is useful to Aten, and with that gesture, the nation shifted with him toward a strange and unfamiliar horizon. Aten, the god who now became the absolute center of worship, had already existed in the Egyptian pantheon as a solar manifestation, but had held a secondary role for centuries. Akhenaten elevated him above all others, isolated him, stripped him of human form, and represented him solely as a solar disk whose rays ended in open hands, touching and blessing the pharaoh and his family. There were no more intermediaries, no more animal faces or hybrid bodies, no more divine multiplicity. Aten was one, invisible and incomprehensible, except through his light. Egyptian religion, until then densely polytheistic, with over 1,000 active deities, was abruptly condensed into a single source of power, the sun. This shift was not merely theological. It was a political act with profound implications. The priesthood of Amun, which had accumulated immense power for centuries, was displaced. Temples dedicated to other gods were closed, their names erased, their images destroyed. Akhenaten banned conventional idolatry and, in many cases, ordered the removal of Amun's figures from statues, reliefs, and obelisks. The regional temple system, which had functioned as a parallel network of control and cohesion, was nearly dismantled from its roots, and in its place, Akhenaten built something new: a city. Halfway between Thebes and Memphis, on a virgin plain beside the Nile, he ordered the construction of Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten, a completely new capital, erected in just a few years and entirely consecrated to the new solar cult. The city, now known as Amarna, was an urban anomaly, an architectural experiment on an imperial scale. There, everything revolved around the pharaoh and his god. The palaces, the roofless temples, designed to allow sunlight to enter directly, the homes of nobles and artisans, all responded to a new order. It was not merely about founding a city, but about materializing a different world. Iconography changed radically. Akhenaten had himself portrayed in a style never before seen. Elongated skull, protruding belly, wide hips, thick lips, melancholic face. The reliefs abandoned classical rigidity to depict intimate, everyday, deeply human scenes. The pharaoh is shown caressing his daughters, kissing his wife, sitting pensively under Aten's rays. The Amarna aesthetic broke with the eternal idealization of Egyptian art and proposed something raw, more real, more emotional. For some, this was a sign of spiritual sensitivity. For others, a manifestation of imbalance. But in any case, it was a deliberate and carefully crafted rupture. Beside Akhenaten shone another enigmatic figure, Nefertiti, his great royal wife. Her image frequently appears alongside the pharaoh, equal in size and hierarchy, participating in offerings, ceremonies, and affairs of state. Much has been speculated about the power she may have wielded, whether she was co-regent or even ruled alone under another name after Akhenaten's death. Her famous bust, found in Amarna and now preserved in Berlin, shows a stylized, almost ethereal beauty that became the symbol of an era. Together with Akhenaten, Nefertiti embodied the ideal of a solar royalty, new, unsettling, and cloaked in an aura of mystery that continues to puzzle us today. But while the Amarna revolution was profound and radical, it was also fragile. The exclusive worship of Aten never fully replaced Egypt's traditional religion. Ordinary people, used to their local gods, their rituals, their temples with centuries of history, never truly embraced this abstract and centralized faith. The suppression of Amun did not erase the memory of his power, and the regime's disconnection from the traditional centers of the country created a rift that was hard to mend. Amarna was not Thebes, and Akhenaten, however much he proclaimed himself the sole son of Aten, was not immune to time. Toward the end of his life, the heretic pharaoh began to withdraw. His presence in official records diminished. Some scholars believe he faced internal crises, perhaps famine, perhaps increasing rejection from the people or his own officials. After his death, the world he had created began to unravel with startling speed. His successor, Smenkhkare, ruled only a few years, and then came the young Tutankhaten, who would soon change his name to Tutankhamun and restore the cult of Amun and the capital to Thebes. The temples of Aten were abandoned, the city of Amarna evacuated, its buildings dismantled stone by stone. Akhenaten's name was cursed, omitted from royal lists, and his memory persecuted as an error to be erased so that Ma'at, cosmic order, could return to its place. And yet what Akhenaten embodied, that urge to shatter structures, to look at the sun and declare that everything must change, could not be entirely destroyed. His face still gazes at us from the walls of Amarna with a timeless intensity. He was no madman, nor a directionless tyrant. He was a visionary who dared to pursue a transformation Egypt was not prepared to accept. And within that tension lies the true heart of his legacy. But Egypt, after that theological earthquake, did not break. It managed to redirect itself, regain its balance, reorganize its myths, and move forward. Because after Akhenaten's rupture came a subtle restoration, but also a renewed affirmation of the traditional. The young Tutankhamun, who had spent his childhood within the walls of Amarna, would be the key piece in that return to order. And with him, history would sink into the golden enigma that continues to captivate the world to this day. The Boy King, Tutankhamun and the Return to Order. After the religious cataclysm of Akhenaten and the dismantling of the spiritual structure that had supported Egypt for centuries, the entire country found itself at a crossroads. The city of Amarna, once proclaimed the new horizon of creation, stood half empty, its temples devoid of worshippers, its streets silent, its walls still imbued with an ideology that no one dared defend openly. In this context of political vacuum and religious confusion, an unexpected figure emerged. Fragile, mysterious, and whose name would go unnoticed for centuries, yet would one day be remembered like no other pharaoh. Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun ascended the throne as merely a child, probably around 9 or 10 years old, in a nation shaken by uncertainty. He had not led armies, commissioned majestic temples, or enacted sweeping reforms. His power was more symbolic than real, and behind his small crown moved the hands of more experienced figures: the Vizier Ai, the General Horem-Heb, the priests of the Old Order, and the scribes skilled in maneuvering from the shadows. Yet despite his short life and seemingly modest reign, he marked a pivotal point in Egyptian history. For with him, Egypt took a decisive turn to leave behind the heresy of Amarna and restore traditional balance. One of his first political gestures was to change his own name. Born as Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, he or those around him understood that maintaining that link to the solar deity of the previous regime was a dangerous burden. Thus, he became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. And with that new name, he once again consecrated himself to the ancient gods, particularly the great Theban deity, whose image had been erased and defiled during Akhenaten's rule. It was not a mere nominal change. It was an act of reconciliation, a carefully calculated gesture meant to signal the return of Maat, the sacred order, through a young, untainted face free from the sins of the past. During his reign, the temples of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were restored. Offerings resumed, priests reclaimed their posts, and both material and symbolic reconstruction began. Although Tutankhamun was not personally responsible for these decisions, his image was used as a symbol of purification. The royal decrees issued during his administration are clear. They condemn the heretical era, reaffirm the traditional gods, and call upon the people to leave behind the trauma of Amarna. Egypt was not merely recovering its temples, it was recovering its collective soul. Nevertheless, the young king lived trapped in a paradox. While he restored the old order, he bore a contradictory legacy. He was likely the son of Akhenaten. He had probably been raised in the very Amarna that now needed to be erased. His wife, Ankhesenamun, had also been born into that solar world, daughter of Nefertiti. They lived in palaces built by the former regime, surrounded by objects still breathing the aesthetic of Amarna. The rupture with the past was, therefore, only partial, loaded with unresolved tensions and decisions driven more by political necessity than spiritual conviction. The young pharaoh died around the age of 18 or 19, leaving no heirs, in circumstances that continue to stir speculation. His body shows multiple anomalies: a fractured femur, skeletal deformities, signs of hereditary and degenerative diseases. Some suggest he died due to medical complications. Others propose an accident or even a palace conspiracy. What is certain is that his death was sudden, and preparations for his burial were rushed. He was laid to rest in a small tomb, likely intended for someone else, hastily decorated. But within that modest tomb, crammed between narrow walls, lay one of the most astonishing treasures ever discovered. For over 3,000 years, the name of Tutankhamun vanished from royal records. His tomb remained forgotten, buried beneath other graves, protected by its anonymity. Until, in 1922, Howard Carter and his team opened a sealed doorway and found an untouched world frozen in time. More than 5,000 objects: chests, thrones, statues, chariots, weapons, amulets, food, wine, textiles. Everything arranged as if the young king might awaken at any moment to continue his journey into eternity. But the most stunning piece was his funerary mask. That masterpiece of solid gold, inlaid with semi-precious stones, serene face, perfect lines, immortal gaze, became the new face of Egypt. An image that traveled the world and returned to the boy king, centuries later, a glory he had never known in life. The ironies of time. This minor pharaoh, with no great conquests or reforms, became the most famous of them all, not for what he did, but for what he unintentionally left behind. Beyond the brilliance of the treasures and the mystery surrounding his life and death, the reign of Tutankhamun represents a delicate, almost silent transition between the complete rupture of Amarna and the full restoration of classical Egypt. His role was that of a bridge, a clean face that allowed the state to reconstitute itself, the people to reconnect with their gods, and the country to breathe again under the ancient form of its beliefs. After his death, the throne was first occupied by Ai, a courtier of the old guard, and then by Horemheb, a general who would go on to establish a new dynasty and definitively consolidate the return to order. But the echo of Tutankhamun, amplified by modern archaeology and the fascination sparked by his tomb, still lingers. His mask, his name, his unfinished story are reminders that glory does not always come through the sword or decree. Sometimes it hides in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by a lamp and a gentle brushstroke. And as the dust settled over the wounds of Amarna and Egypt closed that turbulent chapter, a different figure began to rise, powerful in life and obsessed with eternity. Ramses II, the great builder, the cunning diplomat, the king who left more traces than words. His time would mark a new dimension of greatness. Greatness carved in stone and protected by the propaganda of centuries. Ramses II, the great builder of glory. Imagine a pharaoh who reigned for nearly 70 years, whose image multiplied across temples, statues, and monuments, whose reputation transcended borders. That is Ramses II, a man turned symbol, an architect of his own legend. Upon ascending the throne, he inherited a kingdom restored by his predecessors, but he understood that history does not remember those who preserve a legacy. It remembers those who surpass it. That ambition shaped his reign, an era of architectural glory, bold diplomacy, military campaigns, and magnetic self-celebration. From a very young age, Ramses proved to be a charismatic leader. He learned the art of warfare under the tutelage of Horemheb and Thutmose III, and upon proclaiming himself pharaoh, his first move was to launch an offensive against Libya and the Delta peoples to secure Egypt's western border. These were swift but effective campaigns, demonstrating to his enemies that Egypt remained both an aggressive and reliable power. Yet his most famous victory was still to come. The most vivid story of his reign is the Battle of Kadesh, where he faced the mighty Hittite Empire. Ramses marched with 50,000 men, chariots, and even elephants, determined to reclaim territories in Syria. The battle, fierce and strategic, had no definitive victor, but Ramses masterfully turned it into a triumphant narrative. His temple reliefs depict it as a monumental victory, with him riding alone into the fray and subduing hordes of enemies. It is a blend of military truth and propaganda, of documentary detail and vividly imagined triumph. After decades of conflict, Ramses signed the first known peace treaty in history, an agreement with the Hittite king Hattusili III. It was a diplomatic act of realism that secured stability, commercial benefits, and political prestige. Ramses, however, was an insatiable builder. He sought to leave behind a visible legacy for future generations, something that would outlast his own life. He raised colossal temples throughout Egypt. In Abydos, he erected sanctuaries dedicated to Osiris that evoked the myth of resurrection. But his most renowned achievement is the stunning temple of Abu Simbel in Nubia, carved directly into the rock, its facade featuring 4 gigantic statues of himself, flanked by engravings depicting his victory at Kadesh and his divine lineage. It was a masterstroke, a display of political, religious, and territorial power, of Egypt's dominance over Nubia, and of the pharaoh's control over space and time. Karnak and Luxor also bore his mark. Ramses ordered obelisks to be raised, hypostyle halls to be completed, walls to be filled with detailed reliefs, telling the story of his greatness again and again. Under his rule, Thebes was transformed. It expanded, it was beautified, and it became a stage where religion and politics intertwined masterfully. Every block of stone was a verse, every statue a poem about the ideal pharaoh. But his strategy extended beyond art and architecture. Deeply interested in his own legacy, Ramses meticulously documented royal births, festivals, and Theban processions. He ordered his memoirs to be carved into granite, his names and titles to be woven into Egypt's visual landscape. His figure, Ramses the Great, was crafted for eternity, just as his father, the great universal architect, had intended. In his personal life, Ramses was equally prolific. He had dozens of children and wives, strengthening his family circle and creating a web of internal alliances. His favorite wife, Nefertari, is depicted at his right hand at Abu Simbel, a testament to the political importance of the royal family in his vision. A kingdom unified around his figure. He was a pragmatic leader, fully aware of the images he projected. Ramesside diplomacy was active. He received foreign embassies, encouraged cultural exchanges, and arranged royal marriages to ensure temporary peace. Though militarily strong, Ramses was also shrewd. He pursued diplomacy when war offered little gain. In this way, Ramses consolidated his glory. With his death, the model he had built began to slowly unravel. His son Merneptah succeeded him, but the imperial machinery required more administrative discipline and less personal charisma. Pharaohic power entered a slow decline. But that is another story. Ramses II, the great builder of glory, lived with the awareness that his throne would someday vanish, but his name would not. And so it was. His monuments, his treaty, his divine yet human image, his political energy, they made him an eternal stele. In the next chapter, we will see how the religious, political, and cultural fabric of Ramesside Egypt began to loosen, and how new forces emerged in a world no longer sheltered under his shadow. Gods, magic, and mummies. Everyday life in Egypt. In pharaonic Egypt, the sacred was not a separate realm from daily life. It was the very fabric in which everything unfolded, from sowing barley to curing a fever, from wedding ceremonies to eternal rest. Daily life was steeped in symbols, rituals, spells, and deities that were not left outside the home. They sat at the table, bathed with the family, and guarded their dreams. To truly understand this millennia-old world, it is not enough to admire temples or pharaohs. We must enter the homes of peasants, the workshops of artisans, the schools of scribes, where traditional practices, beliefs, and magic were the bread and fragrance of everyday life. The day began with prayers. Upon waking, a person would recite words of protection for the body, for family members, for the tools of their trade. Household gods were the first to receive attention. The image of Bes, venerated for his power against evil spirits. Figurines of Taweret to protect nursing mothers. Small statues of Nacht or local deities were basic pieces of furniture. To adorn the image with flowers or anoint it with oil was not merely symbolic. It represented an ongoing connection to the sacred that governed every gesture. Magic, Heka, the Egyptian word for the power to transform events through spoken or written word, was present in health, agriculture, and commerce. Scribes and priests composed formulas inscribed on amulets, in potions, and on papyri. If a woman was pregnant, she received ritual instructions to protect herself and her unborn child. If a farmer feared drought, he would pour water over a figurine of Hapi, the god of the inundation. If a child was sick, an amulet bearing the Eye of Horus, symbol of healing, would be placed on them. Medical and magical papyri were filled with guidance for disputes, for dreamless nights, or to reconcile business quarrels. Life was built upon balance between the human and the divine, and magic was the bridge between the two. Magicians, men or women professionally devoted to sorcery, could be summoned in difficult times, to remove an embedded arrow, to uncover who had stolen a cow. In the shelter of a cave or a makeshift sanctuary, they recited enchantments, poured water over papyri, and offered minor sacrifices. Their reputation depended on having retrieved someone who was lost, cured a disease, or summoned rain during a local drought. For them, words spoke, and written symbols summoned the beyond. The danger was not physical but invisible. Forces that could grumble, interfere, and extort from another realm. In the life cycle, the passage to death was a carefully regulated act. Mummification is well known, the process of embalming the body to ensure its preservation. But behind this mechanical act lay a dense cosmology. The Egyptians believed the body must be preserved so that the Ka, vital energy, and the Ba, individual soul, could return and maintain their identity. Priests performed ceremonies such as the opening of the mouth, using wooden tools and gems, to allow the deceased to speak, eat, and breathe again in the afterlife. The tomb, elaborate or modest, became a sacred stage where the living continued to pay homage and ensured the spiritual survival of the dead. Scribes preserved records of possessions, genealogies, rituals, and incantations. Artisans crafted amulets that protected against snakes, plagues, and malevolent spirits. A mesh of knots, a carved scarab, or a piece of ox retina placed in the burial urn. Magic was a tool, practical, daily, functional. The amulets hidden between the wrappings of a mummy could guarantee the deceased eternal life. Among the living, the exchange of such objects was public and common. Amulets were given as gifts to ward off envy, premature death, or infertility. The magic market was a microcosm of the broader marketplace, where the value of a cinnabar stone or a tablet inscribed with invocations could equal that of a small herd. Social life, too, was steeped in the sacred. A marriage was not just a civil contract. It was the union of two souls. Offerings of honey and wine were made to Hathor, goddess of love and music. Blessings were requested from Bes against jealousy, from Mat for fidelity and justice, and from Khnum so the couple could conceive children. Love was aligned with eternal love, as inscriptions in tombs reveal, carved to ensure the bond would endure beyond death. Food culture also carried sacred weight. Bread and beer, staples in the Egyptian diet, were prepared according to ritual norms. Dough was kneaded during the waxing moon. Beer was first offered to the gods and then shared in family or communal feasts. The act of sharing a piece of bread was a cosmic gesture. It meant, I accept your presence. I incorporate your spirit into mine. Eating a handful of dates was a way to thank Hathor and Ra for their blessings. Eating festival meat honored the recently deceased, a reminder that life and death were two sides of the same coin. The day ended with another ritual, the nighttime prayer, asking for protection from sleep demons and nightmares caused by Apophis, the serpent who tried to devour the sun each night. Small figures of Bes were placed beside the bed, the scarab hymn was recited, and a sprig of perfumed plant was tucked beneath the pillow. When a child slept peacefully, it was taken as a sign that the world had remained in balance that day. From Upper Egypt to the Delta, from desert villages to distant oases, everyday Egypt was a subtle web of magic, domestic religion, and ritual practice. It was not a land where the sacred was confined to temples. It was a land where the sacred co-starred in every awakening, every breakfast, every chore, every dream, and every burial. Even women, excluded from high priesthood, participated in ritual offerings, crafted amulets, sang incantations to ease childbirth pain. The entire household became a small temple, where every act contributed to maintaining the order of the universe. And so, among gods, magic, and mummies, unfolded the daily lives of thousands who would never enter a scribe's school or be remembered in royal hieroglyphs. Yet their spiritual and practical rhythm kept the machinery of the empire turning. For a powerful kingdom is not built only on monumental temples or victorious armies, but on homes where people believe that the sacred walks beside them, protects them, and gives their life meaning. And now, after this journey through the intimate spaces of ancient Egypt, where mystery was everyday reality, where magic infused each step, we prepare to gaze toward the horizon of decline, fragmentation, and the onset of a new twilight. Power may shift, but magic and faith endure. And even within the very shadows of the empire, the final signs of transformation begin to emerge. Last dynasties, between priests and mercenaries. After centuries of splendor, Egypt faced a slow decline that did not manifest in a spectacular way, but rather as a silent erosion that corroded its foundations. The borders remained, the temples still stood, and the pharaohs continued to rule, but true power had begun to slip into unexpected hands, those of multimillionaire priests and military leaders supported by foreign troops. In this late stage, between the 11th and the 7th century before our era, Egypt became a board where the most valuable pieces were the alliances with the clergy of Amun and the army of Canaanite, Libyan, and Greek mercenaries, a survival strategy that kept it standing but rendered it unrecognizable compared to its glorious past. The heart of this change lies in Thebes, where the priests of Amun had accumulated such great wealth and prestige that they came to rival the throne. Owners of vast agricultural lands and temples filled with gold, they had their own bureaucracy, their own banks, their own controls over the grain of the Nile. The pharaoh, theoretically the intermediary between the gods and the people, became a decorative figure in the religious context, while true power was forged in the courtyards of Karnak, far from the royal palace. Common men turned into high priests managed numbers, lands, and networks of influence that spanned every cataract of the Nile. To this internal component corresponded an equally decisive external trend: the rise of the mercenaries. With the decline of native legions and the exhaustion of imperial campaigns, the armies were reconstituted with foreign troops, Greeks, Libyans, Canaanites, who found in Egypt a lucrative market and a stage of opportunity. These soldiers, loyal by contract and paid in grain, entered as bodyguards of the court, as recruits for border campaigns, as enforcers of internal vigilance in unstable regions. Their presence transformed the military dynamic. The old model of national strength became a mosaic of foreign contracted units conditioned by clear economic interests and a direct relationship with those who paid their wages. The combination of priestly power and foreign military force designed a landscape of underground tensions. Some pharaohs tried to regain control. Psamtik II and Necho II, for example, relied on Greek mercenaries to weaken Theban power and re-establish a more coherent state. But their victory was partial. Each triumph was also a loan of strength that had to be repaid with interest. The priests demanded tax exemptions and territorial autonomy. The mercenaries asked for lands, punctual payments, and a share of the spoils of war. The balance of power became a precarious and costly dance, difficult to sustain over time. In the midst of this logic of fragmented power, Pharaoh Nectanebo I emerged, who attempted to restore an authentic Egypt by building temples around the country and revitalizing the worship of traditional gods. For a moment, it seemed that the dynamic was returning to its original course. But the intensity of the Theban clergy and the dependence on foreign weapons conditioned his deeds. The Persian Empire, which was advancing through Asia and dominating much of the East, saw Egypt as a valuable prey. In the year 551 before our era, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded the country, supported by local factions and discontented soldiers, defeating the weak Egyptian army that, unrecognizable in its composition and loyalties, failed to sustain resistance. This episode was more than a military defeat. It marked the end of independent Egypt. From then on, the country lived through a long cycle of dominations, first Persian, then Greek with the Ptolemaic dynasty, and finally Roman. But those were other stories with a different tone. In this late Egyptian period, the significant event was not the final defeat, but the way in which the monarchy and the notion of Egypt were emptied from within. Turned into interchangeable pieces, the pharaohs became tokens of prestige, while those pulling the strings were priests and mercenaries. This systemic change had an immediate impact on culture and religion. The priests, by multiplying their domains and wealth, encouraged a cult increasingly complex, esoteric, full of hermeticism and magic. Religious mysteries grew in importance. secret initiations, cryptic rituals, and nocturnal liturgies marked the air of Karnak and Dendera. Contact with foreign soldiers also brought the introduction of new customs, gods, names, and dialects, making late Egypt a melting pot of ancient sacred traditions and new cultural pressures. So it was, a country that had built the universe upon the Nile, now depended on private bureaucratic networks and legions under foreign command. An immense kingdom had become a province of intersecting interests. And yet, religion continued. The pharaoh was still the figure who ritually ascended to the Holy of Holies to meet with Amun, even though the money for that ritual came from the temples, and the warriors who protected him were sons of Greece or Libya. The impact of this dynamic goes beyond political power. The tombs of nobles show for the first time iconographies adopted from the East, foreign weaponry, and Canaanite names. Traditional amulets coexist with Hellenistic and Persian origin symbols. The carpets, textiles, and ornaments displayed in late tombs reveal influences brought by mercenaries or by emissaries of the empire. The material landscape diversified, reflecting a country that was no longer one, but several projects at once. In the end, Egypt survived, redefined its beliefs, aged in cultural blending, and closed its ancient era with a sense of deep wear, but also with the certainty that its history, its memory, and its magic could not be erased by a conqueror. The Egyptian myths, despite everything, continued. The judgment of the soul, the Ka and the Ba, the amulets against bad luck, the nightly prayers. Just as the Nile overflows and deposits silt on the shores, the spirit of Egypt was reborn, again and again, clinging to its ancestors. And while the world entered new orders, Persian imperial, Greek dynasty, Roman rule, Egypt persisted among rituals and amulets, among ruined temples and forgotten kings. In its next explosion of power, foreign rulers with absolutist ambitions would come. Kings descended from Alexander the Great with Greek names, but the foundation remained, a sacred legacy built upon the sands of the desert, the eternal pulse of the Nile, and a spirituality that embraced everything. Thus ended the classical scheme of pharaonic Egypt, beginning the next great episode with a different perspective, new faces, and a different narrative. The Black Pharaohs, Nubia, and the return of the South. When Egypt seemed on the brink of dissolution, ruled by powerful priests and foreign mercenaries, a force from the south emerged to recreate the pharaonic ideal in an extraordinary way. They came from Kush, the great Nubian civilization, descendants of ancient African kings who, for centuries, had been subdued, traded, or assimilated by Egypt. In a twist that seemed impossible, it was these black kings who claimed the crown of the Nile, restored the pharaonic culture, and reformulated its splendor with a different, genuinely African vision. Their story is not merely a late epilogue, but an impressive reinterpretation of pharaonic power, its symbols, and its reach. The return of the South and the rebirth of Nubian glory in Egypt. While Egypt was shrinking under Persian, Greek, or Roman presence, Kush was experiencing a period of strong prosperity and cultural development. Its capital, Napata, near the Fourth Cataract, was a center of power and tradition, heir to ancient dynasties dating back to the kingdom of Kerma. The relationship with Egypt had been ambivalent, subdued during the New Kingdom, later allies and then subjugators, until, in the 8th century before our era, under the rise of Pi, Egyptian campaigns weakened internally. Pi seized this moment. He crossed the desert, marched northward, and through a strategy of alliances with priests, mercenaries, and local populations, he became the first of the Nubian dynasties to rule Egypt for nearly a century. These black pharaohs, Pi, Shabaka, Taharka, Tutankhamun, ruled from Memphis and Thebes, revived temples, and declared that Egypt had entered an age of renewal. The restoration was not merely aesthetic. It was a deliberate strategy to recover the sacred bond with Amun, reinforced in Napata, and to counter the influence of Assyria, which threatened the Middle East. Taharka, in particular, built monumental works. He excavated the Great Pylon at Karnak, commissioned colossal statues, and supported rituals that unified Kush and Egypt under a single cult. His figure is portrayed with shield, throne, and crown in the Egyptian style, but with distinct African features that reflect a resolved, proud, and hybrid identity. This chapter in history returns as an example of how power can travel from south to north, reconnect spiritual lines, and revitalize institutions. The Black Pharaoh was far from being an outsider or a minor invader. His legitimacy was rooted in pharaonic tradition, in the guardianship of the Mat, in control of the Oracle of Amun, and in his military role. Their campaigns reached Libya, Canaan, and Mesopotamia, though not with the same dominance as during the times of Thutmose III or Ramses II. A key point: these pharaohs brought an Afrocentric vision to the pharaonic culture, anchored it in their African Jerusalem, preserved Egypt's religious and political core, and reinterpreted it with cultural depth. The Nubians also introduced their own elements. Their art retained massive blocks, frontal and monumental composition, but incorporated more austere reliefs, smaller upright figures, and columns in the Kushite style. The crowns became mixed, integrating symbols from Kush, such as the horned headdress, with the traditional Egyptian double crown. Taharqa, for example, is sometimes depicted with that double crown, but also with the Kushite headpiece and scarabs engraved with protective eyes. Religion was a central axis of their rule. The process of consecration was no longer overshadowed. Piyi had himself buried in the necropolis of Napata and maintained religious rituals with Nubian gods when he returned to his homeland. Taharqa unified Amun of Napata with Amun of Thebes into a single entity. Homer referred to Napata as the Thebes of the South. The ceremonial connection was real. Caravans brought incense, gold, and papyrus to Kush. Kushite priests taught rituals to their northern counterparts, and hieroglyphics remained the official language of administration. But this renewed reign could not be sustained indefinitely. A new imperial power was rising in the east, Assyria. Rewind. Tiglath-Pileser III, Sennacherib, and especially Ashurbanipal launched massive campaigns against Egypt and Kush. The Assyrian army besieged Memphis, captured Taharqa momentarily, and forced him to retreat southward. Tutankhamun tried to resist, but Egypt was too distant, fragmented between contested valleys, and the pharaonic Nubia vanished under the Assyrian advance. This episode marked the end of the era of the Black Pharaohs in Egypt, leading to Kush's definitive military and political separation from the Nile Valley, although its cultural and religious influence did not disappear immediately. In the south, Kushite royal houses continued to govern from Napata and later Meroe. However, that powerful legacy remained engraved in Egypt's architectural memory. The factories at Aruna, the obelisks, the restored reliefs at Karnak. Their presence became an episode of African exoticism that rewrote pharaonic history. After them came the Persian satraps, the Ptolemies, the Romans, and the Byzantines who occupied the throne. But the mystical combination these Black Pharaohs had consolidated no longer had space. History branded them as Black Pharaohs, but they were, more precisely, African kings who returned pharaonic identity to its sub-Saharan roots, renewing, one last time, the center of power in the ancient kingdom. This return from the south was an unexpected and vibrant closure to nearly 3,000 years of pharaonic history, a lesson in cultural resilience. And as Egypt entered its Hellenistic phase with the arrival of the Ptolemies, laying the foundations for a new cultural fusion, the echo of the Black Pharaohs remained vibrant. Their monumentality, their religion, their African pride, and their renewed idea of power were etched in the stone of the Nile. The ancient kingdom, though worn down, once again revealed its flexibility and energy. After all, the history of Egypt cannot be told without Nubia. Alexander's coup, Egypt in Hellenistic hands. When Alexander the Great, the young king of Macedonia, advanced into Egypt in the year 332 before our era. He arrived not as a brutal conqueror, but as an unexpected reformer. His entry into Memphis was not marked by a devastating battle or a massive display of violence, but by a gesture filled with symbolism. As he stepped down from his chariot at the temple of the Oracle of Amun in the Siwa Oasis, he was proclaimed son of Zeus Amun. That ceremony planted the seed for a new kind of legitimacy. His power did not come solely from the sword, but also from an ancestral spiritual connection to pharaonic Egypt, a bond that transformed him into a pharaoh in the eyes of the people. Thus began one of the most fascinating phases in the history of the Nile, the transition to Hellenistic rule. Alexander understood symbols better than anyone. He knew that if he showed respect for Egyptian traditions, his authority would face less resistance. He dressed in Egyptian priestly robes, made offerings to Amun, and ordered that he be recognized as a legitimate pharaoh. His presence in Egypt was not a raid, but an act of cultural fusion. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, inspired by the model of the Greek city, and equipped it with a port, a lighthouse, libraries, and a geometric urban design that projected a new axis of centrality toward the west. That city would become the epicenter of Hellenistic culture, a bridge between East and West, and a tangible manifestation of the balance between military conquest and cultural syncretism. After Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire. Ptolemy, one of his closest officers, proclaimed himself king of Egypt in the year 321 before our era. He founded a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries, until the death of Cleopatra. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt underwent an unusual transformation. Pharaonic forms persisted, but they fused with Greek culture. Temples continued to be built, but with bilingual inscriptions, hieroglyphic and Greek, and the Egyptian gods began to be depicted in hybrid forms that satisfied both traditional rituals and the Hellenic taste for cosmology and philosophy. Alexandria became the crown jewel. Its great lighthouse on the island of Pharaohs became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, with thousands of manuscripts, became an unparalleled center of knowledge. Philosophers, astronomers, and mathematicians sought its immense splendor. The human brain, the stars, medicine, geography, literature, everything converged there. And while priests in Karnak carried out age-old ceremonies, thinkers in Alexandria looked to the heavens through primitive telescopes, studied Greek papyri, and performed anatomical dissections. The sacred and the rational coexisted in a city that celebrated both spirituality and intellect. Under the Ptolemies, the Egyptian crown maintained pharaonic rituals. Temples were consecrated, offerings were made in hieroglyphs, and the double crown was worn with the same pomp as in the days of Ramses. However, real power was in the hands of a multicultural elite. Greeks in administration, Egyptians in local bureaucracy, Jews and Syrians in trade. There was a pragmatic union between the pristine memory of the pharaohs and Hellenistic practicality. That coexistence, sometimes tense, was the essence of a hybrid kingdom that managed to endure for centuries. Cleopatra VII, direct descendant of Ptolemy I, embodied the ultimate synthesis of both cultures. She spoke Egyptian, Greek, and Latin, presented herself in the temples as a reincarnation of Isis, and in Rome as a sophisticated Hellenic queen. Her romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were political maneuvers to sustain Hellenistic power in the face of Rome. Her death marked the end of a multicultural dream. Egypt entered directly into the Roman sphere, but its Hellenistic pharaonic legacy would continue to echo for centuries in its ruins and in the memory of Alexandria. This episode did not signify the end of Egypt, but rather a profound metamorphosis. Alexandria became the laboratory where religion, knowledge, power, and commerce converged. The Greek language circulated throughout the Mediterranean. Egyptian papyrus was used for classical manuscripts, and the Theban liturgy remained alive in the temples of Upper Egypt. This cultural melting pot left a legacy that continued to influence the world long after the last pharaonic dynasty had faded. From Hyksos heroes to Nubian kings, from Hellenized Greeks to Roman armies, Egypt survived thanks to a virtue that few civilizations possess: its ability to incorporate without abandoning its spiritual core. And although political power passed to other hands, and Hellenistic and Roman dynasties imposed deep changes, the pulse of the Nile and its sacred vision endured. Because the history of Egypt is not the story of an elite, of a skin color, or a language. It is the story of a spirit that adapts and persists. And with this cultural metamorphosis on the horizon, the world of ancient Egypt begins to look toward its twilight. No longer would pyramids rise, nor would pharaohs be raised on the banks of the Nile. But its memory, preserved in scrolls, oceanic cities, and mineral remnants, still beats. And in the end, it still speaks to us through the eternal stone of its temples and the indelible ink of its writings. Cleopatra, the last gleam of the Nile. Cleopatra VII was not simply a queen who ruled Egypt. She was the final glow of a millenary civilization that tried to reignite itself with a new light, blending pharaonic heritage with the exposed nerves of Roman politics and personal magnetism. Her figure became the epicenter of the drama that would seal the fate of the ancient empire. She was not a daughter of the sun like the pharaohs of old. Her roots were both Greek and Egyptian, but within her, the threads of both cultures came together. She was the beacon of an era that sought to reinvent itself, but no matter how hard it tried, it could not prevent the twilight of pharaonic history. From the moment she ascended the throne, Cleopatra demonstrated a strategic intelligence that stood in stark contrast to the machismo of Roman power. At 18 years old, she shared the government with her brother Ptolemy XIII, with whom she engaged in a fierce struggle for effective control of the kingdom. It was then that she met Julius Caesar, who had landed in Alexandria pursuing Pompey and found in Cleopatra an intriguing, cultured, and charismatic ally. She not only spoke Greek and Egyptian, but also knew Latin, could recite poetry, debate philosophy, and negotiate with ambitious rivals. With Caesar, she forged a bond of power that returned the throne to her and allowed her to present herself to her people as the restorer of order. It was during these years that Cleopatra gave herself pharaonic titles, had herself depicted wearing traditional Egyptian garments, and once again made offerings to the gods in Karnak. Her legitimacy combined the military support of Rome with the spiritual endorsement of Thebes. The Nile once again flowed under a powerful female figure, capable of embodying both ancestral authority and an uncertain future. But her story cannot be understood without remembering her deep association with Roman power. Alexander was long gone, the temples still stood, but the world had changed. When Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra did not falter. She quickly traveled to Italy, swept through the circles of power with her presence, and smiled within the Senate. But the Roman drama remained open, and the figure who would truly determine her fate then stepped into the scene: Mark Antony. With him, Cleopatra wove another political and romantic alliance whose nuances went far beyond mere sentiment. She presented herself as the Eastern queen addicted to power, the daughter of Isis, the ruler of a prosperous kingdom that could serve as Rome's ally. She established her court in Alexandria as a center of feasts, art, diplomacy, and contradiction. She displayed maidens, ships filled with myrrh and gold, lavish gifts. There, the Egyptian myth and Roman theater merged into a sensual and fatal narrative. The alliance with Mark Antony was also a declaration of geopolitical will. In the eastern division of Roman territories, Antony entrusted Cleopatra with lands, titles, and power. Egypt became a hegemonic kingdom in practice, though with borders shaped by military dependence. The Nile pulsed under a queen who dreamed of building a new capital, brighter than any Hellenistic Alexandria, wiser than any militarized Rome. But that ambition alarmed Octavian, Caesar's political heir, who portrayed her as the eastern threat against the Roman world. The decisive battle came at Actium, in the Ionian Sea. The order of the Mediterranean clashed with the Egyptian myth in a manipulative and merciless naval confrontation. Egypt lost on the waters. Rome claimed the story. Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, where they took refuge as the final champions of a crumbling world. He committed suicide, believing she had already died. She, a few hours later, chose to follow him. Legend holds that she did so through the bite of an asp, a sacred serpent, a death inscribed in her role as daughter of Isis, consumed by her own 19th century-style narrative. Her death was not silent. It marked Egypt's entry into Rome's orbit. Her body was made public. She was denied burial with pharaonic honors, but her figure could not be buried so easily. In the temples of the south, her followers maintained secret rituals. The papyri of Alexandria began to mix with those of Rome. Egypt cooled its divine face and adapted to its new status as an Augustan province. But there is something in her fall that continues to illuminate history. A woman who sought to save Egypt by being more astute, more cultured, and braver than any military king. Cleopatra was not just a foreign queen. She was a symbol of cultural resistance. She was the last pharaoh to embody the Egyptian desire for eternity in Hellenistic form. She represented the impossible, to be both the mythical sovereign of the last great African empire and the modern regent who could have led the cities of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. She did not succeed, but her legacy still challenges the present. How does a civilization preserve its identity when the world around it changes completely? She was a living question. And although her eyes looked westward, her final gleam fell upon the Nile. After her death, Egypt became a Roman province. Its culture lost political status, but never fully lost its soul. Because the memory of Cleopatra, the queen who died pretending to be a serpent, continued to linger in history, in temples, and in symbols. Like a shattered mirror that still preserves the image of the past in its imperfect surface. And even today, her eyes still gaze upon us from statues and coins, with the same blend of mystery, strategy, and melancholy that she held for her people and the world. And so concludes the final great act of pharaonic history, with a woman who stood against Rome in an attempt to save an empire. An empire that could not be saved, but whose echo remains in the stones, in the legends, and in the infinite treasure of its memory. Beyond the sand, the immortal legacy of Egypt. When the last columns collapsed, when the courts of foreign kings took over the throne and the political heartbeat of the Nile passed into the hands of distant empires, Egypt seemed to have ceased to exist as such. But the true miracle of its story does not lie in tombs or temples, but in its extraordinary ability to survive in the memory of the world. Because Egypt ceased to be a kingdom to become a universal imaginary, an ever-present source of inspiration that spans millennia, an echo of light in the sand that never completely fades. Ancient Egypt no longer ruled, but it reinvented itself through time. Its hieroglyphic writing, mysterious and labyrinthine, took centuries to be understood once again, until Champollion, with patience and wonder, opened the door to its reading. From that moment on, the West began to rediscover it. Half archaeology, half myth. The Egyptomania expeditions of the 19th and 21st centuries crossed the desert like modern Theseuses, extracting blocks, papyri and mummies to bring them to museums where fascination with the exotic blended with the thirst for knowledge. Objects like the mask of Tutankhamun, the bust of Nefertiti, the erotic panel from the tomb of Tanyereneg, traveled the world becoming symbols beyond their origin. The Egyptologist, the tourist, the reader, were exposed to the perfume of spices, the gold, the mystery of a civilization that continued to teach how to build the past with hands and imagination. The cultural impact was profound. Egypt appeared in Western architecture with sphinxes at library entrances, in the sinuous curves of Ramesside death masks, or reliefs that imitated temples on bank facades. European numismatics adopted its iconography, and cinema raised it as a synonym for mystery and beauty. The tale of the living mummy and the magical Book of the Dead turned ancient Egypt into a model for mythical exploration and animated fantastic stories, from Bram Stoker to Indiana Jones, from Gothic fantasy to comic books. The word Egypt became a metaphor for the unknown. More deeply, its spiritual legacy found its way into temples and cathedrals, into medieval alchemy and modern esotericism. Philosophers and mystics considered its magicians, its papyri and spells, as repositories of hidden knowledge. In literature and art, Egypt became a starting point to reflect on the eternal, the sacred, and the human. The meaning of life and death, the judgment of the soul, the concept of the afterlife, the eternal return, all echoed its imaginary legacy. It was a symbolic seed, a spiritual nutrient in times of crisis or the end of empires, as in the 20th century, when thinkers believed its symbols could save the Western spirit. But its legacy was not only spiritual or symbolic, it was also scientific. The architecture of its pyramids, mathematical and astronomical material, inspired the development of geometry and engineering. Its medicine, based on empirical observation and formulas collected in the Ebers and Edwin Smith papyri, anticipated anatomical studies by hundreds of years. Its treatment of water, its irrigation techniques, remain reference points for understanding agricultural development. It was a civilization that built architecture with belief and science, with human warmth and astronomical calculation. In the African countries, in Nubia, along the Nile axis, Egypt continued as living memory. The populations who inherited it preserved stories, customs, rituals. The Black Pharaohs, the language of their secret rites, the music of their tombs, remained part of their richness. In Ethiopia, in Libya, in Sudan, the pulse of ancient Egypt still circulates in craftsmanship, in dance, and in oral memory. Since the last pharaohs vanished, Egypt lived under the shadow of other hegemonies: Persian, Hellenistic, Roman, Arab, Ottoman, British. But none of those dominions completely silenced its heartbeat. Even today, in the streets of Cairo and Luxor, in the bazaars where amulets and papyri, original or fake, are sold, in the temples that have survived or been reconstructed, Egypt continues to portray itself through its own myth. Because a civilization that built the idea of eternity for its king also learned how to build its own, its eternal legacy. In the contemporary era, Egypt became the subject of books, series, video games, and digital museum exhibitions. It became the theme of films: Cleopatra, The Mummy, Exodus, and the protagonist of major exhibits that transported death masks, sarcophagi, and columns across the globe. In current scientific research, it remains a primary focus. The genetics of mummies, the use of satellite imagery to uncover buried ruins, virtual reconstruction of temples. Its secrets are still there, waiting to be unearthed. That is its ultimate greatness. A kingdom of the past that is not past. A dead civilization that continues to teach about life, about art, power, faith, death, about resilience, about how to create images of eternity. What makes Egypt eternal was not its territorial power, its kings, or its political influence. What makes it eternal is its ability to create universal symbols. And here, at this final point, where the story should close, we find that it cannot be closed. Because Egypt reinvents itself every time someone walks again among its ruins, lights a lamp next to a hieroglyph, gazes at the shine on the golden mask of Tutankhamun. Its legacy is immortal because it transcends its own time. Because Egypt is a promise for anyone who wishes to uphold memory, to bear witness to the sacred, to build for eternity. And as long as there are eyes to read, souls to investigate, and hands to excavate, Egypt will remain alive, in the stone, in the myth, in the sand, and in the memory of the human being who dreams of the infinite. And so, after this long journey through the sands of time, we have walked together through the entire history of ancient Egypt, from its first villages to the eternal echo of its temples. If this journey captivated you as much as it did me in telling it, I invite you to leave your comment down below. I want to know which part fascinated you the most, which mystery still intrigues you, or which other worlds you would like to explore. Subscribe to keep discovering civilizations that never truly died. And now, turn off the lamp and let the pyramids continue whispering in your dreams. Good night.